Tempted by a Billionaire by Laura Burton. Billionaires in the City, Book 5. Narrated by Connie Shabshab. Krista. "You're fired." Christa stared at Mrs. Bailey's twisted scowl in shock. She had always known her to be a sweet old lady living in apartment 32A. Now she was standing with her small hands balled into fists and offering a steely glare hard enough to kill 1,000 dreams. "I'm sorry. What?" Christa said, startled. She stood rooted on Mrs. Bailey's doorstep, holding a leash in one hand and her phone in the other. The hand with the phone was frozen in midair. "I've tried to be patient with you, Christa, and I wanted to help when your sweet mama passed away. But you are the worst dog walker I've ever had." Christa stuffed her phone in her jeans pocket and twirled her thick auburn curls in puzzlement. "You've got to be kidding. Poofy had a great time at the beach yesterday." Mrs. Bailey held up her wrinkled hand and clamped her dentures together so hard, Christa imagined them crumbling in her mouth. "That's exactly it. Poofy is allergic to sand, and I specifically told you that yesterday." She wagged a finger at Christa and knitted her white brows together to form one long caterpillar line across her face. Christa rested a hand on her hip and tilted her head in thought. "But, come on, Poofy didn't eat any sand. He was totally fine." "He's dead," the old lady wailed, throwing her hands in the air with desperation. Christa closed her mouth and blinked several times, taking in this unfortunate news. "Oh," was all she could say. Jerry from number 64B just happened to walk by and caught the tail end of their conversation. His Jack Russell yapped at Krista's narrow ankles. "Poofy died, did you say?" he asked Mrs. Bailey. She nodded vehemently back and shot another glare at Christa. "This young lady killed my dog." She thumped her hand on the doorframe. "You killed her dog? What is wrong with you?" Jerry picked up the barking Jack Russell and cradled it like a baby as he sidestepped away. "You can forget walking Banjo." His narrow eyes squinted at Christa before he opened the door and marched out of the apartment block, Banjo yapping at her from over his shoulder. Christa sighed and turned back to Mrs. Bailey, glimpsing a flicker of satisfaction awash the old lady's face. "Please, Mrs. Bailey, wasn't Poofy 20 years old? Are you sure he didn't just die of old age?" Christa discovered there was no reasoning with the lady as the door slammed shut and she was left staring at the peeling white paint in shocked silence. After a moment of self-pity, she turned and walked down the hall. Dazzling sunshine greeted Christa as she left the apartment block and walked out onto the street. The heat of the sun warmed her exposed skin, but a gust of sea air made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Whenever a day got off to a bad start, Christa would venture out to the coast and walk along the beach to calm down. It was the best part of growing up in Los Angeles. Sand, sun, and salt water were never far away. It was difficult to stay in a bad mood in such surroundings. Christa removed her sandals as she stepped off the sidewalk and walked along the sand. The tide was out and crowds of tourists had set up camp along the beach, sunning on loungers and playing volleyball. She spread out her arms and twirled on the spot, blissfully unaware of the bystanders giving her odd looks. Christa Powell was a free spirit. Her mom raised her alone and kept crystals around the house. Every morning they walked barefoot along their private corner of the beach and practiced yoga with the sunrise. They had never had a lot of money, but her mom's inherited apartment had a balcony that overlooked the seafront, and there was no place on earth Christa would have rather been. After a long battle with an autoimmune disease, Christa had to say goodbye to her mom and carry on alone. Christa missed her terribly, but she often dreamt about her. She had become a gentle voice in Krista's head, and every corner of beach reminded her of happier times. Krista did not believe in having a big shot career. There were far too many hours of work and stress involved, and not enough time to actually live. So, she took on small jobs to pay the bills. Still, it seemed difficult to commit to just one. Now that her short-lived dog-walking business had died, the only job she had left was at Joey's, a small ice cream parlor on the pier. Overindulging in double fudge frosted mountains did not help her waistline, but Krista was okay with wearing slightly bigger jeans in exchange for a happy and fulfilling life. Diets were stressful, after all. Krista skipped along the beach to the waterline and dipped her toes in. She took a deep gulp of air. The sea lapped against her calves as the tide moved in and rolled back over her ankles as it swept back out to the ocean. That delicious sensation never got old. Seagulls honked as they swooped over Krista's head. She shielded her eyes and watched a couple of them as they landed on the sand and pecked around looking for food. A vibration in the pocket of her shorts jolted her out of the blissful moment. "Hey, Joe. I'll be in soon," Krista said after answering the call.
"Sorry, this is Benjamin, Joe's brother."
The voice on the other end of the phone sounded like Mr. Darcy, British, gentlemanly, and low. Krista stopped walking and squinted at her phone again. "Well, hi, Benjamin," she replied, not knowing what else to say to this unexpected caller.
"I'm sorry to tell you this, but the ice cream parlor is closing down. We don't need you to come in today."
Krista frowned and looked up at the brilliant blue sky. The universe sure does want me to have a bad day. "That's a real shame," Krista said, which was an understatement considering she had now been fired twice in one morning. "Why?" There was a heavy silence for a moment.
"The owner passed away."
The voice was frank and slightly broken. Krista held her hand to her mouth as her breath caught in her chest. "Joe is... your brother is..." An ambulance sped past and its shrill sirens interrupted Krista's thoughts. Oddly, she could hear the sound coming from the phone, too. "Are you on the beach?" she asked quickly.
"What?"
Krista looked up and scanned the crowds, looking for a man on the phone. Sure enough, there was a man, and he stuck out like a sore thumb amongst the beachgoers. He sat next to a stroller wearing a dark suit and black shoes. A stack of books and papers sat by his feet, and he looked disgruntled by the sunshine as he held a phone to his ear. "Hey, I think I see you." Krista bounded out of the water and ran across the sand to join the bewildered man.
"What?"
he repeated as Krista reached him. "It is you." Krista folded her arms triumphantly as she beamed at the strange man in the suit. He held his hand up to his face to shield it from the sun as he squinted up at her. "Hi, I'm Krista. We spoke on the phone?" She chuckled to herself as she stuck the phone in her pocket and offered a hand.
"Krista. Right. This is awkward."
Benjamin took her hand and shook it gently. His hands were surprisingly smooth. A babbling sound took Krista's attention, and she looked at the stroller to see a baby dressed in a pink onesie. "Your baby is cute. Don't you think she's hot, wearing long sleeves?" Krista cooed at the baby, who stared back with wide eyes.
"She's not mine,"
Benjamin said bluntly. Krista glanced at him with surprise, then caught sight of the deep track lines from the sidewalk. "You know, people don't usually bring their babies out on the beach in this type of stroller. The wheels sink right into the sand." Benjamin dragged his hand across his face and sighed. "Sorry. You're doing a great job," Krista added quickly. She crouched to get a better look at him. "Wait, is this baby—"
"She's my niece."
Benjamin picked up his books and sighed.
"I'm sorry about your job. I'll make sure you get paid for a couple of weeks, to give you time to find something else."
"I don't envy you," Krista said, sitting down with her legs crossed. Benjamin looked up from his book and laughed.
"And why do you say that?"
he asked. Krista scooped her hair back into a ponytail as she considered the question. "Well, I'm sorry about your brother. I didn't know Joe that well, but he was a great guy to work for, totally chilled out and down to earth." Benjamin inclined his head and looked away.
"He was."
Krista rubbed her arms and made faces at the baby. "So, you've got a baby now, huh? Where's her mom? What's her name?"
"Maggie."
"So, what's the plan?"
"Sorry."
"You know, with the ice cream parlor, why are you closing it down?" Benjamin sighed and packed his books into a briefcase.
"You do ask a lot of questions. Don't tell me you're an undercover reporter."
Krista threw her head back and laughed freely. The very idea of being stuck in an office 9 to 5 had her howling. "No, I'm not a reporter," she reassured him. "I'm unemployed now, actually." She bit her lip and tickled the baby's arms. "Don't you love baby rolls? I could just eat her up."
"I'd rather that you didn't eat her."
Krista dropped her hands and studied Ben's expression, trying to gauge whether he was being serious. "You're not looking for a sitter, are you? I'm great with babies." It was not an entirely truthful statement, but Krista considered herself a fast learner. Besides, she needed a job and Benjamin clearly needed some help. This could be a win-win scenario.
"No, I'm fine. I'm only going to be here for a month, 6 weeks tops. I need to sell up the business and get Maggie's passport. Then I'm taking her back to England."
Krista had never noticed Joe to have an accent, but thought it better not to ask, seeing Benjamin's troubled face. "Okay, suit yourself," Krista said as she dusted off her legs and got to her feet. "Well, good luck. Sorry again." At that moment, the baby's babbling turned into an ear-splitting scream. Krista began to walk away, watching Benjamin from the corner of her eye as he attempted to soothe the baby.
"Thanks, Christa. Come on, Maggie. Let's take you home and get a bottle."
Benjamin made to leave, grunting and huffing as he straggled to drag the stroller across the sand. Krista stared for a few minutes, then rolled her eyes and marched over to him. "I can't watch this. Let me help you," she said, picking up the stroller from the bottom. The two of them carried it to the sidewalk. The baby flapped her chubby arms and squealed as a giant spit bubble popped between her rosy lips.
"Thanks. I'm new to all this,"
Benjamin said, gesturing to the giggling baby and the diaper bag on his shoulder. He scratched his temple and looked down with his eyes furrowed for a moment. Krista tilted her head to the side and studied him. If there was a man who looked like he had the whole world on his shoulders, he was standing in front of her.
"All right,"
he said, looking up.
"What's your rate?"
Krista fiddled with her bangles and hummed to buy her some time to answer the question. In all honesty, she would have worked for free just to help the poor guy, but a girl needs to eat. "Shall we just go at the same rate I was on at Joey's?" she suggested. Benjamin opened his mouth to reply at the same time as Maggie let out another scream.
"What's wrong now?"
he asked the baby. Krista surveyed the child's scrunched-up face and picked up a pink blanket from the basket. "The sun's in her eyes. You should get her a hat, you know." Krista tied the blanket to the handles and fashioned a hood to shield the sun from the baby's face. Maggie blinked several times and rubbed her eyes with a yawn.
"I have a car waiting. Would you like to come over and have a chat?"
Benjamin's voice sounded hopeful. Krista hesitated. "Well, sure, I guess." Krista was not known to be the most streetwise person on the planet. It had got her into more than a few sticky situations. But the thought of this man walking off with a baby, clearly with no clue how to take care of her, lowered Krista's defenses. Besides, he was Joe's brother, not a total stranger, and helping a person in need was what Krista lived for. "Okay," she announced, her face beaming as she nodded. Benjamin's face lit up for a moment, then he settled into a casual smile as he led the way. Maggie giggled and babbled as they marched along the sidewalk amongst the heavy stream of beachgoers. The brilliant blue sky and happy vibes in the air made it difficult to take in the gravity of the situation, but Krista caught sight of the worry lines on Benjamin's handsome face and told herself he was grieving. She knew what it was like to lose a loved one, and that kind of pain does not go away just because the weather is nice. "Here we are," Benjamin gestured to the black, stretch limousine idling by the side of a road. A man in a top hat opened one of the doors and stood with a polite smile on his face. "Thank you, Theodore." Krista peered into the limo before she stepped inside. It was no place for a baby. The black leather chairs matched the shade of the carpeted floor, and a minibar sat in the center. Tiny spotlights dotted along the ceiling sparkled like stars, and the leather glistened. As Krista took a seat and fastened a seatbelt, she looked up to see a small TV screen staring back at her. "Where's the car's baby carrier?" Krista asked as Benjamin followed, holding Maggie close to his chest with one arm. He sat down, settled the baby on his knee, and offered a guilty smile. "I'll just hold her. She's fine." Krista forced a smile. The two of them sat in awkward silence as Krista looked out of the darkened window, watching the streets pass by. They followed the coastline for a long time until the car turned back towards the beach and followed a private road to a gate. "This is my brother's house," Benjamin explained as the gate rolled back. The car pulled forward and Krista noticed high rocks creating a natural barrier to the rest of the beach. Krista sat up straight and bit her tongue to stop making noises of wonderment as they pulled up next to a beautiful beach house. The walls were made up of glass and a large porch stretched around the entire perimeter. "It's beautiful," Krista said. She looked back to see Benjamin making funny faces at the baby as she squished his cheeks together with her chubby little hands. "Yes, I'm your Uncle Benji. Yes, I am," he said in a baby voice. A little part of Krista melted at the sight. She thought that perhaps this rich bachelor was not going to be such a hopeless dad after all. "Come on inside, and we'll talk about a proposition." He looked at Krista, turning formal again. Benjamin. 4 weeks ago. Benjamin stood on his balcony overlooking the manicured gardens as he cradled a cup of tea in his hands. The golden rays of morning sunshine flooded the sky, making it orange with a tinge of pink. It offered the perfect filter. He pulled out his phone from his pocket and propped it up against a ledge. Setting the timer, he leaned against the wooden balcony and looked away from the phone with his best smolder. The phone flashed and he retrieved it. Staring at his picture, he slid his tongue across his lips and set his cup down. Then he tapped his thumbs on the screen and posted the picture on his social media. #BlessedLife. #NoFilter. He picked up his cup again and took a grateful sip as his phone buzzed. Having over 1 million followers, it never took long for likes and comments to come flooding in after a post. Benjamin Harris liked to regard himself as an eligible bachelor, although it was not because of his extensive portfolio in real estate or for his philanthropy. He did own a great number of properties and businesses, and he had spent a great deal of his resources to help startup companies, as well as sponsor many charitable foundations. But he considered himself to be quite a catch on the basis that he had mastered the ways of a woman. He knew exactly what to say to make her weak at the knees, how to caress the curve of her jawline to make her bottom lip tremble, and he spent many hours a week on the tennis courts to maintain his firm physique. His life was good. He spent the weekends in the country, shooting clay pigeons with his schoolboy friends, and enjoyed many evenings taking women out to dinner, but he never saw the same one twice. He had no intention to settle down, not while he still had a couple of years left in his 20s. In fact, the idea of marriage and raising a family could not be farther from his mind. Until he received a fateful call that would change everything. "Mr. Harris, my name is Yvonne Hines. I'm a solicitor working on behalf of your brother, Joseph Harris." "What bind has Joe got himself into now?" Benjamin asked with a roll of the eyes. Joseph was the complete opposite to Benjamin. After falling in love with a young American girl while studying abroad, he had settled in Los Angeles and embraced family life, complete with a baby girl and golden retriever by his side. Joseph was reckless, led by his heart and quick to jump into any challenge. He was always getting into money troubles. "I apologize for sharing this news over the phone, but Joseph and his wife, Andrea, were involved in a small aircraft accident." Benjamin's hands began to tremor, and his cup slipped from his hold. It tumbled over the edge of the balcony and smashed all over the slate patio. Benjamin descended the metal steps from his private jet and entered the car without saying a word to his staff. He had not dared open his mouth throughout the entire journey for fear that his breakfast would make a reappearance. He was numb, working on autopilot as he went through the motions. Yes, his brother and sister-in-law had died. He knew that. But the fact had to be put in a box and filed away to deal with at another time. There were more pressing matters to focus on. "You have an appointment with the solicitor in 1 hour. Why don't you go freshen up and change?" Iris said, her gray eyes lingering on his sweatpants. Iris was a good assistant, astute, organized, and brutally honest. She was the only person on her team who could get away with it, too. "Right, I'm on it," Benjamin muttered as he walked up to his brother's vacant house. The sun's reflection from the wall-length window blinded him. He frowned. His brother had odd taste. Benjamin could not understand how anyone would want to live in a glass box on the edge of the sea. He much preferred the privacy of a brick-and-mortar building nestled away in the country, away from prying eyes. Stepping inside the house was like having a knife slice into his heart. A plume of cinnamon filled his nostrils as he walked around this once happy family home. Now, it sat empty and hollow, with the memories of his brother haunting his every move. "Mr. Harris, first off, I want to say how sorry I am for your loss. I appreciate that this is a difficult time." Benjamin gave a curt nod. His ears rang so loudly he had to strain to hear the faint voice of Yvonne, the solicitor sitting across the desk. Her dark eyes flew upwards as the door was thrust open. Benjamin swiveled in his chair to look and found himself buried in the arms of an elderly woman. "You're Benji, aren't you? I'm sorry we haven't met before. I'm sorry. The woman released her iron grip on his shoulders, and Benjamin gasped as his lungs took in a gulp of air again. "You must be," Yvonne began, but the old lady stumbled to the desk and thrust out her hand. "Gina Gray. I'm Andrea's mama. I can't believe this is happening." "Please, take a seat, Gina. Thank you for coming." Yvonne gestured to the chair next to Benjamin. He clamped his hands over his kneecaps and squeezed as Gina slumped into the chair with a sniff and pulled out a white lace handkerchief. "My baby. My only baby," she said, her eyes leaking tears at an unstoppable rate. Yvonne cleared her throat and picked up a stack of papers on her desk. "As I was just saying to Mr. Harris, I am very sorry that we have to have this meeting today." Gina leaned forward and slammed her frail hand on the desk. "I was 45 when I had Andrea. Frank and I thought we'd never have children. She's our miracle baby. Then Frank left me for a 20-year-old Malibu Barbie, and now my sweet Andrea is gone." Benjamin wasn't sure whether to pat the lady's back or keep his hands to himself. He offered a sympathetic glance before looking back at his knees. Gina struck him as the type of person to talk at length about her entire life story to anyone. She rambled for 10 full minutes about her failing health and asked multiple times, "What am I to do now?" Benjamin wished he knew how to answer that, but the same question had also been plaguing his mind. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Gray, but we do have a few important matters to discuss." Gina fell silent but for a little whimper and nodded quickly as she dabbed the handkerchief across her shiny brow and upper lip. "We are here today to discuss the last will and testament of Joseph and Andrea Harris." Benjamin looked up at Yvonne, who shuffled the papers in her hand and sat up straight, turning official. As she read out the will, Benjamin's mind began to wander. Less than 12 hours ago, he stood on his balcony enjoying another sunrise in the English countryside, with no cares nor worries to spoil his excellent mood. Now, he sat in a stuffy office on the 24th floor in a building on the coast of a beach in Los Angeles. The blazing sunshine illuminated dust particles in the air, and Benjamin watched them float around in the space between him and the solicitor with a hollow feeling in his gut. "Mrs. Gray, you are bestowed with an 1869 grandfather clock. Here is a letter for you." Benjamin dragged himself out of his head and watched Yvonne brandish a white envelope with cursive handwriting on the front. Gina swiped the letter from Yvonne's outstretched hand and tore through the envelope as her chest heaved. "Oh, my baby! Oh!" She flapped a hand as her face turned beetroot. Large teardrops rolled out of her eyes, and they flew back and forth as she read the words. "She wrote this recently. Look, here, she mentions Maggie." Gina thrust the tear-soaked letter in front of Benjamin's face. He could not read the words, though. Gina's trembling hands made the paper rustle like a leaf blowing in the wind. "I'm sure they never truly expected this to happen. But Mr. and Mrs. Harris wanted to amend their will should anything happen while they went away, especially concerning their daughter, which brings me on to the next item." Yvonne picked up her glass of water and took a sip as Gina dabbed her eyes and sat up straight, nodding along. "Yes, I know they want me to have her. I've already made the arrangements." Benjamin caught a flash of something in Yvonne's eyes, but could not work out what it was. Surprise? Annoyance? She drummed her neatly trimmed fingernails on the mahogany desk for a moment and cleared her throat. "It is Mr. and Mrs. Harris's final wish to have their surviving infant, Margaret Joy Harris, live with her Uncle Benjamin Harris." As if Benjamin was not already shocked enough, he was utterly stunned now. "Me?" he said in a weak voice. He glanced at Gina, who gave him a look so venomous, he wondered if looks really could kill. "The beach house and savings are to be transferred to Margaret when she reaches adulthood." Yvonne continued talking in an official voice, apparently unaware of the blazing fury emitting from every pore of Gina's body. "Joseph bestows his business, Joey's, to Benjamin." This final act was evidently too much for Gina to bear. She threw her hands up and started to rant in a high-pitched screech. "Are you kidding? He gets everything? The baby, the house, the business, and all I get is a clock? This is ridiculous." Benjamin took the envelope from Yvonne but did not open it before Gina rose to her feet. "I'm going to call my lawyers and contest the will. Andrea wanted me to look after Maggie. What does this playboy know about raising a child? Take the business and the house, but you are not taking my grandchild." Benjamin raised his hands. That's fine. I agree. I don't know anything about a baby. I'd honestly do a terrible job." Yvonne shook her head. It's not that simple. Benjamin, you can relinquish your rights, but the baby will not automatically go to the next of kin. There's a process, and it will be lengthy.
What does that mean? Where would she go? Gina asked.
Well, if Benjamin does not take her, she would have to remain under care until the paperwork is complete.
And how long will that take?
Gina added quickly, fanning herself with her hand. Her chest heaved up and down at an alarming rate, and her crimson face had Benjamin worried she might soon have a heart attack. Weeks, possibly months, Yvonne said in a sterile voice. Gina wailed and wobbled to the window with a sniff.
I'll take her, Benjamin said with a somber nod. Neither of us want my niece to end up in care. Where is she? I'll take her right now.
Yvonne pressed a button on her desk, and a moment later the door to her office opened. In rolled a stroller with a sleeping baby girl snuggled up with her thumb in her mouth. Benjamin's heart warmed at the sight of her. The prospect of having the responsibility was daunting, but the child looked so peaceful, so serene. He wondered how bad it could be. Present day. Benjamin sat in the limousine holding Maggie close to his chest as Christa talked at full speed. He had expected to face some awkward conversations while closing down his brother's business, but he had not expected to bump into one of Joe's former employees on the beach. And then take said employee home to his brother's house with a baby in tow. Usually, when Benjamin took a lady home, it would be with drinks flowing and his arm wrapped around her. He'd shower her with compliments and smooth chat-up lines. This scenario could not be farther from his normal life. He studied the woman with free-flowing red hair fanned out past her shoulders in tight curls. Her full figure was emphasized by a narrow waist, and the red blotches on her cheeks and legs told him she burnt easily. Her most striking features, however, were her round blue eyes. They sparkled like jewels as she smiled at him and captivated his attention, as if she held him under a spell. Wow, is it awkward staying in your brother's house? It's got so many windows. Don't you worry about privacy? Krista said enthusiastically. She shot him a nervous side glance as if catching herself and wondering if she had offended him, but her cheerful nature and innocent, albeit rather nosy, questions were refreshing. Benjamin patted the baby's back with one hand and lifted her up a little with his other arm. Maggie sighed and snuggled into his collarbone. A little patch of drool wet his shirt as she settled into a deep sleep. The car rolled to a stop and Christa climbed out with ease. As Benjamin followed, he moved carefully so as not to wake the baby.
It is a little strange,
Benjamin said quietly as they walked to the front door. The sea breeze rippled Christa's hair, and her brows pinched together as she gave him a sympathetic smile.
Take a seat. I'll just put the baby down,
Benjamin said, pointing to the white breakfast bar in the kitchen. Christa hopped onto one of the bar stools and offered him a thumbs up. On Benjamin's return, he found Christa by the windows, her phone out and pointed at the beach. He resisted the urge to snap a picture of her, but took a mental shot instead. Right. Well, he clapped his hands and Christa jumped before she turned to him.
Why don't you tell me about yourself?
Christa twirled her hair as her eyes shot around the kitchen, apparently trying to decide what to say. She's cute when she's nervous. Wait, stop checking her out. Benjamin reprimanded himself just as his eyes began to scan her body. I'm a Pisces. Christa settled on a bar stool again and patted her denim shorts to an imaginary beat. I'm very spiritual. I believe in God. And even though I have no close family left on this side of the veil, I am very family-oriented. Benjamin's brows lifted before he could stop himself. He had never met anyone like Christa before. The women in his social circles were of an entirely different caliber. Star signs and horoscopes were mocked, not referenced in an interview, and their sole focus was on keeping up appearances or on their next weekend getaway, not around family.
Do you have a partner?
I have Rodney, my partner in crime, Krista offered, grinning at him with a glint in her eye. Benjamin swallowed.
Ah,
he said, struggling to think of how to word his next question.
Is he your husband, boyfriend? Do you live together? What hours can you work?
For a reason he couldn't understand, none of them sounded appropriate. Krista shook her head with a bubble of laughter. He's my chameleon. Benjamin opened his mouth, but no sound came out, his throat suddenly dry. Beads of sweat gathered along his brow, and he became aware of his heart beating against his chest. Tell me what you need, Krista demanded, her expression turning serious. Benjamin's eyes floated to her swollen bottom lip, shiny with gloss. He needed a distraction from the grief swirling around in the pit of his stomach like a constant ache. He needed to get away from this house and forget about the mess he was in. But that was not what Krista would expect to hear. So he cleared his throat and crossed the kitchen.
I need a drink. Would you like one?
He offered, turning on the coffee machine. Krista raised a hand and shook her head. I'll take a water, she said, her eyes narrowing at the coffee maker as if it was an enemy. Benjamin prepared their drinks and joined Krista at the breakfast bar again. He tried not to stare as she took several long gulps until she finished the glass and slammed it on the marble countertop with a triumphant grin.
Wow, I never knew downing a pint of water could be so exciting,
he remarked, cradling his mug in his hands. Krista laughed like a songbird as she briefly touched his arm. You should try it sometime. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, mirroring each other's smile until the front door suddenly opened with a bang. Where is my grandbaby? Benjamin groaned inwardly at the sound of Gina's voice. He looked up to find her staggering into the kitchen with a cane in her hand. She stopped short at the sight of him, and her beady eyes flitted to Krista for a moment. Your brother has been dead for 10 minutes, and you're already playing Casanova in his home? The words stung far greater than Benjamin wanted to admit, even to himself. Even though the woman was not entirely correct, he had been having less than pure thoughts about Krista, and he would have quite happily taken this feisty redhead out for dinner, then proceeded to charm her all evening.
No, Gina.
This is, Benjamin began, but Krista hopped down from her stool, marched over to Gina, and offered her hand. You must be Maggie's grandma. Benjamin has told me so much about you. I'm so sorry for your loss. My name is Krista Powell. I'm here to look after Maggie. It took all of Benjamin's resolve not to let his mouth hang open as he watched Krista shake hands with a bewildered Gina. Oh, so you got yourself a live-in nanny. Well, that's something. Gina shot Benjamin a suspicious look before smiling at Krista. I look forward to getting to know you, Krista. Now, is Maggie in her room? I'll just go and take a peek. Before Benjamin could speak, Gina shuffled out of the room and headed for the hall. Now alone, Krista grinned sheepishly at him as she fiddled with the hem of her shirt. I guess I didn't help very much, she mumbled, glancing at the doorway. Benjamin dragged a hand through his dark hair and scrubbed his stubbled chin.
No, probably not,
he said finally, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Krista picked up her glass and took it to the sink and began to hum to herself while Benjamin considered the situation. Obviously, Gina was not going to leave him to raise Maggie without her input, and as she lived just a few streets away, it would be unrealistic to expect that she would keep her distance. But she wouldn't be too much of a problem for too long. Soon, he would be back in England and far away from her. Benjamin looked up at the doorway to find Gina had returned. "Speak of the devil." "I want to discuss our schedule with you," she said. He nodded and gestured to a seat at the table. "I had Maggie every Tuesday afternoon and Saturday morning. Before—" Her voice faltered, and she looked down for a moment as if to control her emotions. Benjamin swallowed. "Andrea and Joe always invited me over for Sunday lunch, too." Gina's eyes bored into Benjamin's as she spoke, daring him to argue. "All right," he said with another nod. Gina's expression softened, and she turned to Krista, who had just downed another pint of water. "I'll be back to pick up Maggie tomorrow then. Make sure she has a bag ready." Christa nodded. Her face was serious as she offered a salute. Gina's white brows twitched, and her lips formed a straight line as she studied Christa. Then she sighed and left again. When the front door slammed shut, Benjamin turned to Christa, whose face had turned sunny again. "So, do you want to show me to my room?" she asked. Christa. Christa looked around her apartment, her mind reeling with the twists and turns of the day. Not only had she lost both of her jobs, she had landed a full-time position as a nanny for Joe's very British brother. She bit her lip with a laugh as she peeked through the blinds covering her window and watched the limousine idling outside the apartment block. Correction, Joe's very rich, very British brother. Even though Joe owned the ice cream parlor and had a beautiful beach house on the seafront, he drove a truck and wore jeans. He had kept his hair long and scruffy and spent his spare time surfing. At least, that was what Christa had heard. Benjamin wore a suit on the beach and walked around with security not too many steps away, and he had a driver to take him places. What a contrast. As Christa threw the contents of her closet in a bag, she replayed the meeting with Gina. Of course, with Benjamin's perceived wealth and hired help, it would make sense to assume Christa would be a live-in nanny. But Christa didn't expect to work full-time looking after a baby. "Keep it cool," she told herself, as she picked out a handful of her favorite crystal bracelets and placed them carefully in a side pocket. "You're a bright, happy, free spirit who can totally take care of a kid." She swallowed against the bubble of nerves rising from her chest and picked up a jacket. Then she stood in the center of her room and looked wistfully at the window. The setting sun illuminated her bed in a warm, golden glow. "What are we going to do with you, Rodney?" she said in a baby voice as she walked over to the vivarium by the door. A green chameleon looked at her sideways, with a grumpy look on its face. Then, its eye rolled up and down before it climbed a vine oblivious to Krista's raging emotions. Krista was torn. She wanted to stay in her bubble, surrounded by mood lighting, silk flowers, and tie-dye blankets. But she had talked herself into a predicament with Benjamin. He had explained that Gina was dead set on taking full custody of Maggie, which, for reasons he did not share, he was not going to allow. Now, Gina supposed Christa to be a full-time nanny, and Benjamin did not want to correct her on that. The poor guy had already been through enough. Christa didn't have the heart to make things more awkward, so she went along with it. Besides, it would only be for a month, 6 weeks tops. With that final thought, she blew a kiss at her pet chameleon and rolled her bag out of the room. "Hey, Hank! Can you take care of Rodney for me?" Christa called, banging on the door to number 9B. She stared at the peeling blue paint when it flung open to reveal an elderly man with an entirely bald head. A deep line appeared between his dark eyes as he frowned in thought. "The lizard?" he asked in a deep, husky voice. Christa nodded. "Here's a spare key. There's a tub of locusts on top of the vivarium. Just throw in some leftover vegetables from time to time. Otherwise, they'll start eating each other." Hank's face contorted with repulsion as he took the key from Christa.
Where are you going?
He held onto the door frame as he leaned against it, eyeing the bag in Krista's hand. I've got a nanny job.
Christa? Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, we've all heard about what happened to Poofy. If you can't look after a dog, do you really think you should be trusted with a kid?
Hank asked in a deep New Yorker accent. Krista's smile stiffened as she rolled her lips inwards and clamped her teeth together. I'll be fine, she forced out in a calm tone as she began to walk away. I'll be back on Saturday to check in. Look after yourself. She waved back as Hank mumbled to himself and closed the door again. Krista lived in a block of apartments that were predominantly occupied by retired residents. Her apartment had belonged to her grandmother before it was passed to her mom, and all the folks in the block knew her. The old saying goes that it takes a village to raise a child, and Krista was certainly raised by a village. When her mom passed, she had a whole community to wrap their arms around her. She was safe, happy, whole. Now, she was venturing into new territory to look after another human while dealing with the family politics that had come about following a death. She expected the next few weeks to be eventful, but she took a deep breath and prayed as she sat in the limo. She believed there was a plan for her, and as long as she trusted her gut feelings and allowed God to lead the way, she knew all would be well. She would be able to help Benjamin get through this difficult time in his life, and that gave her a sense of fulfillment. As she walked up to the front door of the beach house, she caught sight of Benjamin walking across a room wearing nothing but a towel, his hair damp and drops of water clinging to his perfectly defined arms and legs. She gulped as her eyes scanned his muscles, and her stomach tightened. I'm going to live with this British stud. Then, she thought perhaps her intentions were not entirely altruistic after all. Her lips curved upward as she rapped her knuckles on the door. Benjamin. Benjamin jumped so violently at the sound of a knock on the door he nearly lost his towel. He grabbed a fistful to stop it falling from his waist and hurried to the walk-in closet, closing the door behind him. One of the security guards would let Christa in, he figured. As he reasoned, it would look unprofessional to open the door to his new nanny while half-naked and fresh out of the shower. He changed into a pair of slacks, pulled on a tight shirt, and ruffled his hair before checking his reflection in the wall mirror. His eyes glanced at the clothes on the rails, never to be worn again, and his stomach panged.
Mr. Harris, Krista Powell is here, a muffled voice called out to him from behind the door. Thanks, Albert. I'll be out in a minute, he called back. After a couple of deep breaths, he marched out of the closet with his shoulders squared and exited the bedroom.
Oh, hey! Maggie was crying, so I picked her up. I hope that's okay. Benjamin stopped short and resisted the urge to hold his hand to his chest at the sight of Christa carrying the baby. Maggie's little hands reached out and took tiny handfuls of Krista's bright red hair, and she blew spit bubbles with a giggle before burying her head in Krista's chest.
No, you carry on.
Benjamin strolled over to join Christa in the hall and halted a few steps away, not sure whether to take the baby or keep staring as Christa hummed a lullaby and rocked the child from side to side.
Sorry about that. I was just taking a shower, he explained, rubbing his neck.
Yeah, I saw you, Christa said while looking down at Maggie in her arms. Then her eyes grew wide and shot to Benjamin as heat rose to his face. I mean, I didn't see you in the shower. I was at the doorstep and I swear, I'm not a peeping Tom. Her face was almost as red as her hair now as Benjamin scratched his chin with a nervous laugh.
I guess I should be more careful next time. You never know who's watching.
He winked at her, and she turned to Maggie, making cooing noises. Well, Do you want me to draw a bath? She asked. Benjamin looked at her blankly. For the baby? She added. Benjamin's chest tightened as he laughed.
Right. Yes, I expect she will need one.
Benjamin led Christa to the bathroom and turned on the faucets. Steam flooded the bathroom and fogged up the mirror hanging on the wall. Benjamin watched Christa juggle the baby in one arm and pour bubble mixture into the running water. She turned to look at the bath, then the baby, and appeared to hesitate.
Is something wrong?
Benjamin asked. He was about to leave, but Christa's expression had turned unsure. I have a confession to make. I've never bathed a baby before. She grinned guiltily at Benjamin, who stared at her with a sinking heart.
What?
Christa stood up and sat Maggie on her hip as she drew in a deep breath. I don't know why I said I was great with kids. I have no experience with them. I mean, I think I would be great with kids. How hard can it be? But now I'm worried I'm going to drown the baby. Benjamin dragged a hand through his hair with a sigh. It would serve him right to hire a nanny without taking her references. Not that she gave him much choice. Once Gina arrived and made the assumption backing out was not an option. I'm sorry. I just don't want to lie to you. Benjamin studied Christa's sincere expression and smiled. Honesty was a quality he valued highly, and yet seemed so rare to find in people. He knelt down beside the bath and Christa followed suit.
Right. Let's try this together. Like you said, how hard can it be?
After watching a couple of how-to videos online, Benjamin checked the temperature of the water by sticking his elbow in the water, as Christa got Maggie undressed. Then Benjamin hovered his hands next to the baby as she splashed and giggled. Bubbles popped and Maggie babbled and squealed as Christa took a soapy rag and washed her under her arms while Benjamin watched like a hawk. Maggie was wriggling a little too close to the faucets for his liking. It was a team effort, but soon the babe was clean from head to toe and the bathroom floor was only slightly flooded. I think we ran the water too long. It was like a swimming pool for her, Christa said thoughtfully as her eyes scanned the puddles on the floor. Benjamin nodded as he pulled the plug. Is there a towel? She asked, holding the baby still in the bath. Benjamin opened a cupboard from the corner of the room and pulled out a pink fluffy towel. He handed it to Christa, and she scooped Maggie up in a bundle. I guess we need a diaper and a onesie.
They'll be in her bedroom. This way.
Benjamin led Christa out into the hall and along a narrow landing. They entered a huge room with pink and yellow striped curtains, a white shaggy rug in the center, and a huge cot overflowing with toys and blankets. Here, take her. Christa handed the pink towel bundle to Benjamin and launched into action. He secured Maggie in his arms, patting the drops of water away from her face and smiling as she waved her hands across his stubbly beard with a gleeful squeal.
Is that scratchy?
He asked her, waggling his brows at her. She babbled back and stuck a thumb in her mouth, gazing up at him with big seafoam eyes. Okay, I can totally take this from here, Christa said, clapping her hands and reaching out for the baby. With a twinge of sadness, Benjamin handed Maggie to Christa and cleared his throat.
Right. I'll leave you to it. Now I need to pack a bag for Gina tomorrow.
Way ahead of you, Christa said, jabbing her thumb in the direction of a small diaper bag sitting next to her. Benjamin stuffed his hands in his pockets.
Looks like you've got everything handled. I don't know what you were so worried about. You're a natural at this. Wait, isn't that nappy on backwards?
Huh? Nappy? Christa shot him a puzzled look before glancing down and made a noise of exclamation. Oh, you mean diaper. Whoops. She flashed him a grin as she fixed the problem. There. You were saying? She looked pointedly at Benjamin, then threw her head back with a chuckle. Benjamin laughed too.
Night-night, Maggie. When you've put her down, come and join me in the living room. We can go over your schedule."
Krista nodded along and waved. "Sure." She turned to Maggie with a beaming smile. "Say night-night to Uncle Benji." "Night-night," Maggie said in a light, breathy voice. Krista looked up at Benjamin with her mouth hanging open. "Oh my goodness, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Benjamin's cheeks lifted as he stared at Krista setting about putting Maggie into a yellow onesie. Then he left the room, his heart aching a little less. Krista. "Okay, we've read a book, sang a song, tucked you in. Now I guess it's time to go to sleep," Krista said to Maggie, who sat up in her crib blinking at her. Something told Krista that this kid was not planning on going to sleep anytime soon. She revisited the checklist on her phone and tapped her forehead. "Bottle!" Maggie's face turned gleeful, and she grabbed the bars of her crib. But," she said. Krista got to her feet. "I'm on it. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back." She shook her head to herself. She's in a crib. Of course she's not going anywhere. Krista hurried down the hall and found Benjamin sitting amongst a pile of papers with a laptop on his lap. "Hey." He looked up at the sound of her voice and scrambled to clear up the paperwork littering the couch. "I'm pretty sure I need to make a bottle for Maggie. Do you know if she drinks cow's milk or formula?" Krista asked. Benjamin launched to his feet and crossed the room.
"Bottle. Right. Follow me."
Krista followed him into the kitchen area and watched as he rooted through the cupboards.
"Here we go."
He pulled out a box of formula and studied the box for a few moments.
"So, according to this, she needs to have a full bottle. But the last couple of times I've made one up for her, she's only had half."
Krista set about preparing a bottle, acutely aware she was under Benjamin's gaze. Her hand shook a little as she tried to keep composure. She wanted to appear confident, like this was not the first time she'd prepared a bottle. Once finished, she glanced up to see Benjamin giving her a reassuring nod. "I'll just go give this to Maggie." A few minutes passed by and Krista returned to find Benjamin had resumed his position on the couch, but the paperwork had been neatly stacked to the side. He looked up as she entered and sat up a little straighter.
"I took the liberty of getting you a drink."
He gestured to the tall glass of water sitting on the glass coffee table. Krista smirked at his formality. "Why, thank you," she offered in her best attempt at a British accent, then glided to an armchair in a ladylike fashion. It was like she had wandered into a Regency novel. Benjamin gave her a strange look before he returned his steady gaze on the laptop sitting across his legs. He had his feet up on a footstool and his toes wriggled as he typed. "Maggie fell asleep pretty fast. You'd think that milk was laced with sleeping pills." Krista laughed at her own words as Benjamin's brows furrowed at the screen. An awkward silence followed, and Krista sat on the edge of her seat, chewing the inside of her cheek as she listened to the tapping of Benjamin's keyboard. The sky was dark, but for a few twinkling stars, and Krista could no longer see the ocean through the floor-length windows. Yet, there was a calmness in the air, the kind that could only be experienced beside the sea. She closed her eyes and allowed her mother's face to enter her mind. She had tight red curls cropped to her jawline, and her earlobes had an elegant curve to them. Her thin lips lifted into a warm smile, and her eyes sparkled. "Miss you, Mom."
"I expect Gina will be here to collect Maggie early tomorrow."
Benjamin's voice snapped into Krista's head, and the image of her mom dissipated. She opened her eyes and smiled at Benjamin.
"Something tells me she's an early bird," he added.
Krista nodded. Then a burning question rose to the forefront of her mind. It had been nagging at her all day, but she hadn't found the right time to bring it up. Now seemed like as good a time as any. "Are you really closing down the ice cream parlor?" Benjamin looked at her with surprise, as if this was an unexpected change of subject. Krista thought that was odd. She worked at Joey's, and he fired her that morning. Had it not been an elephant in the room to him? Yes, I am." He cleared his throat and scratched his cheek with a disgruntled look on his face. "Why?" Krista pressed. It didn't make any sense to her. Why not keep his brother's legacy going?
"Because it's in a lot of debt, and I don't see it as a viable business."
Krista chewed her lip as she picked her cuticles. "But it was your brother's company. Don't you want to keep it going in his memory?" Benjamin's expression grew dark now as his eyes flashed at her. She'd overstepped her mark, and she knew it. "Fine, it's none of my business." She raised her hands in defeat. "But have you ever been to the ice cream parlor?" Benjamin closed his laptop and looked at Krista seriously.
"You ask a lot of questions, considering we've just met."
Krista shuffled in her seat and picked up the glass of water from the coffee table. "Well, I think you're in shock, and that's clouding your judgment. I don't want you doing anything rash." She took a gulp as Benjamin wagged a finger in her direction.
"Interesting point," he said. "Nothing rash. Like getting a nanny for my niece, who it turns out has no idea how to look after a baby."
Krista put down her glass and twirled her hair. "Exactly. You've been making some poor choices today." She had hoped her light banter would lift his mood, but it only seemed to have the opposite effect. Benjamin stood up and walked over to the windows. His reflection glowed on the glass, and Krista caught sight of his grimace.
"What would you do?"
he asked as he turned back to her. Krista pressed her lips together and hummed in thought for a moment. Then she jumped to her feet and rested her hands on her hips. "Take me to Joey's tomorrow. After Gina collects Maggie, just don't make any decisions tonight. Okay?" Benjamin stood tall and still like a soldier as he appeared to consider the idea. Then he gave a curt nod. Krista crossed her arms. "Good. That's settled then." Her eyes scanned the empty candy bar wrappers on the couch and the half-empty cup of coffee no longer steaming on a side table. "Are you hungry? I make a mean mac and cheese," she offered, pulling her hair back into a ponytail. Benjamin turned to the window again.
"No, I'm not hungry."
Krista dropped her hands and clamped her teeth against her bottom lip. "Okay. Neither am I," she lied. Her stomach grumbled, though she hoped not so loudly that it gave her away. "I guess I'll head off to bed then. I want to make a good impression on Grandma Gina after all." She flicked her hair back behind her shoulder and beamed a bright smile, but Benjamin did not turn to look at her. He merely stood by the window, shoulders slumped, and Krista knew that he was no longer present. He was trapped inside his own head, probably playing out all sorts of depressing scenarios. Krista pitied him. She wondered if she should give him a sympathetic pat on the back or a friendly hug, but neither seemed like an appropriate action to take, so she turned on the spot and walked down the hall towards the guest bedroom. A heavy silence hung in the air until Krista was just closing the door, and then she could have sworn she heard a muffled sob. "Don't worry, Benjamin. I'll help you figure all of this out," she silently promised as the door clicked shut. Benjamin.
"Krista, are you awake?"
Benjamin pushed the door open a little to see Krista sat bolt upright in the king-size bed. She clung to the covers and blinked into the dazzling sunlight pouring in through the windows. Yes, I was definitely not sleeping just now," she said, turning back to look at Benjamin.
"I thought you said you didn't want to lie to me,"
he said warmly, humored by her response. She rubbed her eyes and yawned, looking at Benjamin sleepily for a moment. Then, as if her brain finally caught up with the situation, she let her mouth hang open and cried out with shock. "What time is it?" She leapt out of the huge bed and stumbled barefoot across the floorboards in an oversized shirt and rummaged in her bag. Benjamin jumped back behind the door and nearly had a heart attack as she pulled her shirt upwards with no hesitation. "You don't need to rush. I was just checking in to see if you were okay," he said, studying the wood grain of the door. "Gina's gone with Maggie already." A thump followed by a shriek filled the air. Then Christa reappeared from behind the door as she flung it open. "What?" Her curly hair stood on end like a wild red mane. It took all of Benjamin's self-control not to smirk at the sight of it. Krista's eyes flew to his wrist, and she grabbed it to look at his watch. "I never sleep in this late. Oh my gosh, I'm the worst nanny ever." She paced the room while forcing a stack of crystal bracelets on her right arm and huffed. "I'm sorry. I was up all night worrying about you and the baby and the ice cream parlor." She marched with her hands flying up and down as she ranted. Benjamin couldn't help but smile. "And then I go and spoil everything by sleeping in. I'm such an idiot." Benjamin took a step in the room now that Christa was dressed and held out his hands as if to steady a wild horse. "I'd prefer it if you didn't call yourself an idiot," he said gently. "Besides, I came here to offer you an apology. There's no need to apologize to me." Christa promptly stopped pacing and dropped her hands as she gawped at him. "You? Apologize to me?" She pointed at her chest and pouted, and for a moment Benjamin was taken away by her raw beauty. He crossed his arms and shuffled his feet, suddenly self-conscious under her line of sight.
"My behavior last night was out of character. I was rude and unkind to you. I know you are only trying to be helpful, and I'm sorry for snapping at you."
Benjamin uncrossed his arms and patted his legs, then scratched his wrist. He suddenly became unsure about what to do with his hands as Christa stared at him with her mouth hanging open. Then, slowly, her mouth widened into a massive grin. "You are the nicest guy I've met," she said, taking a few steps towards him. He staggered back. This woman made him nervous. "You are completely within your right to be a jerk to me. I was being pushy and nosy and—" She stopped and averted her eyes as she bit her lip. "Let's just call it even, shall we?" she finally said, offering her hand. Benjamin took it and they shook on it. "Now, when you're ready, I've prepared breakfast." Benjamin shared a smile with Christa and left the room. In normal circumstances, he would have flirted with her or ran away. He wasn't sure. But Christa was his nanny, and they both had a job to do. He tucked his polo shirt into his pants and surveyed his reflection in the hall mirror. Then he pulled the shirt out again. "Get a grip, Benjamin." A few minutes later, Christa walked into the kitchen. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun and her face beamed at him like a summer's day. "Did you make all this?" she asked, impressed. No, he didn't, but the cook had just left the building and she would never know. Yet Benjamin couldn't bring himself to lie. He shook his head lightly with a laugh.
"I thought I would treat you to a full English,"
he said in a friendly manner. Krista's eyes bulged and her face paled. What?" she asked. Her eyes hovered down his body before flying back up to meet his gaze. Benjamin's face warmed as he caught on to her thoughts. "Breakfast," he forced out, his entire body stiffening. "A full English breakfast. It's sausages, eggs, beans, toast." He lifted the lids of the hot plates and Christa burst out laughing. "Oh, cool." She tiptoed to the counter and dipped her finger in the beans. Benjamin's mouth grew dry as he watched her taste her finger and hum. You know, I've never had a full English before, she added in a deep, playful voice. She made to elbow bump him but missed and chuckled to herself. Meanwhile, Benjamin stood frozen on the spot and momentarily lost his ability to speak.
Is she flirting with me?
He shook the thought out of his mind and picked up a plate. Cooked tomato, he said, offering to serve one to Christa. Her face contorted as she eyed it, making no attempts to hide her repulsion. No thanks, she replied, raising a hand. The two of them bantered back and forth as they ate in the sunny kitchen, and Benjamin almost forgot about the ache in his heart. So, when are we going to Joey's? Christa asked, just as Benjamin finished loading the dishwasher. We can go now, if you're ready, he said. Christa bounced on the balls of her feet and fist-pumped the air. Great, she said. She beamed at him, then flung her head down as she dragged her curls back into a loose ponytail. When she straightened and patted her hair, her face was flushed. I'm ready. Christa. Benjamin opened the car door for Christa, but she crossed her arms and raised her brows at him. We're not driving, she said firmly. Benjamin frowned at her for a moment, then looked at her with amusement. We're not, he asked. Christa spread her arms out and pointed at the glorious sunshine beaming down on them. It's a beautiful day, and the pier is less than a mile from here. She surveyed Benjamin's dark suit and heavy black shoes and hummed. He looked like an undertaker. Do you have to wear a tie? You need to loosen up a little. Benjamin's face turned serious and he shook his head. I'm fine, he said curtly. If you want to walk, we can walk. It's a nice day after all. The two of them walked up the private path towards the road in silence. Christa glanced back at the two bodyguards, keeping a distance but following them. So, what do you do exactly? She asked, looking back at Benjamin as he tugged on his collar. Beads of sweat clung to his temples underneath the unforgiving sun. I'm an entrepreneur. I manage a portfolio of businesses and property, he said, keeping his eyes ahead. That doesn't sound boring at all, Christa said with a laugh. Benjamin shot her a look before breaking into a smile. I'd have you know, my friends tell me that I'm extremely fun to be around. They rejoined the roadside and walked beside the steady stream of traffic towards the pier. The familiar sounds of traffic and birds honking was a comfort. Christa took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the present. You're fun to be around? Christa thought for a moment. What do you like to do? For fun? I play tennis, and I'm an excellent squash player. Ah, so you like sports. That's fun. And I enjoy parties. Now you're talking, Christa nudged him playfully. Do you like karaoke? I'm the king of karaoke. Benjamin grinned at her proudly. Christa chuckled. That sounded like a challenge. There's a karaoke bar on the pier. We should go sometime. Benjamin hummed in agreement as they returned to the beach. The pier sat in the distance, already surrounded by tourists. Did you know you are nothing like your brother? Christa remarked. Her stomach tightened as the words came out. She had once again spoken her mind before she thought about the consequences. But instead of taking offense, Benjamin nodded. I know, he said with a heavy sigh. He was a lot more carefree. He fell in love over here and set up this life by the beach, while I stayed home and took care of our dad. Krista's mouth opened as she sensed a shift in the tone of his voice. "What's wrong with your dad?" she asked. Benjamin looked away and cleared his throat. "Parkinson's. I did everything I could to keep him home, but in the end he had to go to a hospice." His voice broke and he halted for a moment. Krista rested her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Benjamin glanced at her, his eyes glistening. "It's fine. I don't talk about it very often." He waved a hand aside and the two of them continued to walk. Krista chewed her lip as the pieces of the puzzle began to settle. She wondered if Benjamin resented his brother's choices and the wonderful life he had built in sunny Los Angeles, while Benjamin stayed home caring for his dad. Maybe that's why he wants Joey's to close down. The two of them crossed the boardwalk and discovered a crowd of people standing outside the ice cream parlor. "Christa, do you know what this is about?" Irene, one of the residents in her apartment block, wobbled against her cane as she pointed at the sign on the door. Krista took a closer look to see a piece of paper stuck to the door with the word "closed" scribbled on the front. "What are all these people doing?" she asked Irene. The old lady tapped on the shoulder of a man, and like a ripple effect, the crowd of people directed their attention at Benjamin. "Who are you? Are you buying this place? Where's Joey?" The questions came flooding in, and before long the crowd of people started pressing in. Krista glanced at Benjamin, whose face paled as he stared at them all like a deer in headlights. "Back away, please. Not so close. Move along." Benjamin's bodyguards forced their way in and used their tall frames to block people from getting too close to Benjamin. "Do you have a key?" Krista asked, holding out her hand to Benjamin. He pulled out a set of keys and handed them to her silently, still staring ahead. Krista unlocked the door and the two of them pushed through. "Watch the door," Benjamin muttered to his guards. They nodded and took position outside the door. No one was getting inside. "You know, you should speak to those people. They're regulars and they love this place." Krista pointed to the people who were now trying to peer through the windows. She looked back to find Benjamin had gone. She looked around wistfully at the metal circular tables, usually full of happy families. The abandoned freezers were still fully stocked with ice cream cakes and treats, and there was the counter, usually packed with staff and customers. Krista missed the hustle and bustle, the rush of preparing sundaes and cones at rapid speed while chatting with the locals. But without the people in it, she realized it was just a cold, empty room. "Why did you want me to come here?" Krista looked up startled. Benjamin sat on one of the tables with a picture frame in his hands. She walked over and took a look. It was a picture of Joe and his wife standing outside the parlor, grinning and waving. "I took this picture," he said, his shoulders slumping as he stared at it. "You think I'm being callous, but I'm not. The company won't survive, and I'm not selling it. So it only makes sense to close it down." Krista pulled out a chair and sat next to Benjamin. "Do you know why this place didn't make a profit?" She didn't wait for an answer. Joe was always giving away free stuff and donating to local community events. He didn't care about profits. Benjamin shook his head with a light laugh. "Why does that not surprise me?" "Call the staff back. Or I will, if you want. Eli, Joel, Stefan, let them work this place while you're here, before you make a final decision. If it doesn't make a profit and you don't change your mind, fine, but at least give it a chance." Krista resisted the urge to glance away, but held eye contact as Benjamin appeared to think about it. A sea of hands patted against the glass window as numerous heads rocked side to side. Krista hurried behind the counter and opened up the freezers. "Everything is still good. We could open up now for a few hours. What do you say?" She gave a reassuring nod to Benjamin, who glanced back at the picture in his hands. Then he stood up and placed it back on the yellow-painted wall.
Okay, Krista. But you'll need to teach me. I've never made an ice cream sundae in my life.
Christa beamed as she saluted to them. Right, she said, throwing a yellow apron over her head. She tied it as Benjamin strolled over to the door.
Ready?
He asked, with one hand on the lock. Christa cracked her knuckles and gave him the thumbs up. Benjamin opened the door and a flood of people spilled into the parlor as Benjamin shouted over them.
Okay, come on in, everyone.
Benjamin caught himself staring at Christa several times as they served the customers. She was charming and witty, making the people laugh with her jokes and expertly preparing the ice creams in rapid speed. He decided she was a machine. She could work her hands and brain independently, all while holding a conversation. A human could not do all that. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, and before long all of the tables were heaving with happy customers. He took the role of wiping down the tables, changing out empty ice cream tubs and replacing them from the freezer in the back room. He removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar after an hour. The work was breaking him into a sweat. "Where is Joey?" It was a question asked 1,000 times. Benjamin took every measure necessary to stop the news of his brother's death making it to the tabloids. Not until the funeral had passed, and even after that, it didn't feel right to announce it. Christa avoided answering the question, much to Benjamin's relief. He did not want the agony of having to explain over and over why he was there and Joe was not.
Right. Closing in 5 minutes.
He nodded to his bodyguards, who passed on the information to the huge line of people waiting outside. "See? We easily took in a couple of $1,000 during the lunchtime rush," Christa said as they locked the door. Benjamin took a breath. Sweat soaked into his shirt and he longed to take it off and walk into the sea to cool off.
That was a hard graft, though. You were incredible.
Krista's face turned crimson and she waved a hand as if trying to act modest, but her lifted cheeks gave her pride away. "I wasn't I?" She lifted her shoulders with a cheeky grin. "Bet you're sorry you fired me now." Benjamin's goofy smile faded as he looked at his watch.
That reminds me. Maggie. Gina will be back soon. We better go.
He glanced at the unwashed bowls and scoops littering the counter, and the takings needed to be counted. "I'll go. You can finish up here."
You sure?
Benjamin asked. Christa placed her hands on her hips and cocked her head to the side. "I'm the nanny, remember? It's sort of my job."
"I'll send one of my guards to go with you,"
Benjamin offered as he handed her the key to the beach house. Christa pulled off her apron and hung it up, standing on tiptoes to reach the peg. "You don't need to do that. I'm a big girl. I think I can walk back by myself." She flexed her small bicep at him and waltzed out of the parlor without another word. As soon as the door closed behind her, Benjamin exhaled, struck by the feeling that the place had grown cold and empty once more. Hours rolled by as Benjamin busied himself with cleaning up and completing the admin work. Christa was right. In just a few short hours, the parlor took in more money than he could have ever expected. Joe had not told Benjamin that he had been donating to charities and giving away products. Now it suddenly became clear why the expenses always outweighed the income. Joe was not a businessman. He was a people person. His phone pinged. He glanced down at the screen and moaned to himself before taking the call.
"Everything okay, Iris?"
he asked, trying to sound positive, but he knew a rant was coming. "There's a woman here with your niece claiming to be your nanny." The accusatory tone in her voice made Benjamin on edge.
"Yes, I hired Krista Powell yesterday. Do you have a problem with that?"
he challenged. The line fell silent except for heavy breathing on the other side. It's my job to take care of these matters, Benjamin. Have you run a background check on her? What do you know about this woman? Benjamin pressed his fingers to his temple and rubbed it in circular motions. Iris was his personal assistant and took it upon herself to have a say in everything Benjamin did. She had been a lifesaver during the last few weeks, taking care of all the funeral arrangements, purchasing flowers, and handwriting the thank you notes for the attendees. If it wasn't for her, he would have been hiding on an island, drowning his sorrows until Christmas. She knew Joe, and she's great with Maggie, he said. Are you sure? Because she's taken the child out to do baby yoga on the beach. Something about needing to keep the baby grounded. Iris did little to hide the derision in her voice. Benjamin snorted. Yes, she's a little different. But I need the help, and it's good for Maggie to have a woman. I'm a woman, Iris snapped. Benjamin frowned. Iris often talked to him straight, but this was crossing a line. I'm not saying you're not. He stood up and paced the room, kicking a stool under one of the tables as he passed. I need you to set up a meeting with an estate agent, and I need you to empty out the beach house. They call them realtors here. I've already got one booked for tomorrow, and I'm way ahead of you. I had a team come in and clear everything out today. They've just left the necessities. Benjamin nodded as his chest tightened. Good, he said, as his throat constricted. The thought of strangers entering his brother's house and taking his possessions made him feel nauseated. But when he attempted to sort through it all by himself, he actually was sick. Thank you, Iris. How is the hotel? Are you comfortable? It's fine, but I'll be glad when we're back in England. Now, I've spoken to the chef and he's given me a list, so I need to head out to the shop. Are you happy for me to leave this woman with Maggie? Absolutely. Also, could you pick up some clothes for me? I need something more casual, for the beach. Benjamin heard a guffaw on the other end of the phone. Finally decided that Dorme Vanquish II and Sand don't mix. They ended their conversation and Benjamin locked up the ice cream parlor. The sun was already beginning to set across the horizon, and for a moment, Benjamin just stood, looking out at the beach. Streams of people walked by, blurring in his vision as he zoned in on the sparkling waves of the ocean. The tide rolled back and forth as if the sea was breathing, and the constant chatter of people around him merged into one constant mumble. Are you ready to go, sir? One of the bodyguards said. He had a buzz cut, and his arms bulged out of the seams of his suit. Benjamin nodded and walked down the boardwalk with his hands in his pockets, his bodyguards following closely behind. As Benjamin approached the beach house, he spotted Krista and Maggie playing in the sand. Christa was building a sandcastle just as Maggie hammered her tiny fists into it. Their giggles floated in the air like the seagulls, and soon had Benjamin smiling broadly. Oh, hey, Christa said, looking up at him as he approached. You'll never guess what I've just discovered. A devilish grin took over her face. Christa. Christa decided that looking after an almost one-year-old baby was not so hard after all. Maggie was a delightful baby. She had a wide smile that showed the couple of white tooth pegs in her mouth, and she babbled almost constantly. She also had a small vocabulary of words. Wow was her favorite word to use. She said it when she pointed at the sea and to the birds circling the sky. She said it when Christa played peekaboo and again when she saw her Uncle Benji walking towards her. That last wow, Christa could relate to. Benjamin's hair was windswept, and he rolled the sleeves of his shirt up to expose his defined muscular arms. He had undone another button, and the sunset glowed on his body, making him look like he had just walked out of an action movie. Wow, indeed. During Maggie's nap, Krista decided to do some digging online. She was not active on social media, but managed to find Benjamin on Joe's friends list. Her mouth fell open as she scrolled through Benjamin's posts. He posted everything. His breakfast of poached eggs on multi-seeded bread, shaking hands with company directors, selfies with squash opponents, and oh, so many shirtless poses. Leaning against a balcony, reclining against a chair with a smolder, or just flexing his muscles in front of the mirror. This was a side of Benjamin that Christa never knew existed, but she liked it. Benjamin's smile turned to a look of horror as she waved her phone at him. "I followed you on Instagram." Benjamin dragged a hand through his messy hair and looked away with a sheepish smile.
"Ah, you found me then."
He stooped down and picked Maggie up in his arms. She cuddled into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Benji," she said in a baby voice. The sight made Christa melt inside. "You were right. You are fun. And insanely sexy," she added silently with a smirk. "Well, you might notice I haven't posted for a month." He pointed at her phone as he bobbed Maggie up and down. Christa got to her feet and patted the sand off her legs. "Well, I'm sure your 1.2 million followers miss you. Let me take a picture of you with Maggie." Christa positioned her phone up to capture a picture of Benjamin stooping his head low against Maggie's brow. She looked up at him with big eyes, and her hand touched his cheek. The two of them were perfectly framed by the sunset and glowed dark against the ocean. "Your followers will die when they see this." Just as she said the words, her hand slapped her mouth, and she looked at Benjamin, who was now talking to Maggie. Thankfully, he did not seem to notice Krista's tactless comment. "Here, give me your phone." She reached out a hand. Benjamin hummed as he looked at her with his brows knitted together. Then he handed his phone over and looked back at Maggie. "Did you have a good day, Maggie Moo? I hear you did some baby yoga. Was that fun?" Krista smiled to herself as she sent the photo to his phone and posted it on his Instagram account. #myworld, #bittersweet, #family. "Done," she said, and gave the phone back. Within seconds, his phone pinged multiple times as notifications came through. Krista looked at the comments and grinned. "Told you." Benjamin switched his phone off and stuffed it in his pocket. "I'm starving," he said, heading for the beach house. Krista collected the blanket and diaper bag while Benjamin walked with Maggie up the beach. She stopped for a moment, holding the blanket in one arm and the bag resting on her shoulder, and her heart warmed at the sight of him snuggling the baby in his arms. Maggie's face popped up above his shoulder, and she beamed her bright smile at Krista as they walked away. For a moment, Krista could picture what her life could be like with a baby. She wasn't sure if it was the golden sunset casting an unrealistic glow across the scenario, or the fact a sexy billionaire was holding the cutest baby in the world. But Krista's heart rate quickened, and her hands grew clammy as she realized she wanted this moment to last forever. 2 weeks rolled by so fast, Krista could no longer keep up. They say time flies when you're having fun, and time was really zooming. She willed it to slow down as she and Benjamin settled into a routine. Benjamin met with several realtors, and Krista worked on keeping the house presentable for viewings with Maggie attached to her hip. Doing everything one-handed soon became second nature, and the times she put Maggie in her playpen or down for a nap left her feeling weirdly imbalanced, like she was missing an appendage. An open house was arranged, and nearly 100 people came to view the property. Benjamin struck up the courage to make a formal announcement of Joe and Andrea's passing. The ice cream parlor continued to run, and for a while, life settled into a new normal. Apart from the flood of flowers and cards from sympathizers, it seemed that the whole world had become obsessed with the story of a British billionaire coming to America to take care of his baby niece. He had just become the most wanted bachelor on the West Coast. He even had to hire another assistant to manage all the extra media attention, much to Iris's annoyance. But Benjamin appeared unfazed by it, as if he was used to receiving thousands of fan mail from the opposite sex. He would work on his laptop and take calls in the living room, while Christa took Maggie out for walks along the beach. They would eat dinner together, and Benjamin would play with Maggie until they bathed her. Christa grew comfortable taking care of Maggie, and could even manage the bath with one hand, but did not resist Benjamin's help. Though neither of them said it, there was a feeling that the two of them were acting as foster parents. In the evenings, they watched movies or sat in the living room in a comfortable silence. Being around Benjamin felt normal. It was difficult to imagine that this new life was temporary. Christa could have stayed in the beach house with Benjamin for the rest of her life. They had grown comfortable around each other, and Maggie was a ray of sunshine. But the more days passed by, the more her stomach knotted at the thought of it all slipping away. What Christa did not realize was their little game of happy families was about to come to a bitter end sooner than she had imagined. A man in a dark gray suit and slicked-back hair arrived on the doorstep just as they were sitting down to eat. He held out a large brown envelope and handed it to a bewildered Benjamin. "Mr. Harris, you've been served." Benjamin. For a while, it had seemed like everything was settling into place. There were 2 potential cash buyers for the beach house. The ice cream parlor was bringing in some money, and Maggie seemed happy with Christa. Gina was civil when she came to visit, and Christa insisted on making a lasagna for Sunday dinners. At the last Sunday dinner, they had all sat around the table, with Maggie slamming her fists on the tray of her high chair. Gina made pleasant conversation, and Benjamin thought all was well. Gina hadn't even shot one glare in his direction. Little did he know, she had been scheming behind his back, and now, as if he didn't have enough on his plate, he had a legal battle to deal with. "What is that?" Christa joined him in the hall with Maggie propped against her hip. Benjamin remained frozen with the front door wide open, looking at the letter in his hands. He blinked and looked at Maggie, who stared up at him with big, glassy eyes. 5 weeks ago, this would not have been a big deal. Yes, Joe and Andrea bequeathed Maggie to him. They wanted their daughter to be raised by her uncle, but Gina was her grandmother, and he was a rich bachelor who loved his life in England. Was he ready to take on the responsibility of a baby? Yet for 6 weeks, Maggie had become part of his world. He took the baby from Krista's arm and held her to his chest. She wriggled and rested her head on his collarbone, then grabbed his shirt with a sigh, content to be in his embrace. "Benji," she said with a delighted squeal. His chest squeezed as her sweet baby scent flooded his nostrils. "Gina is going for custody," he said finally. Krista's eyes widened as she motioned to take the envelope, but hesitated. "Go ahead," Benjamin said, handing it to her. He bounced Maggie in his arms, trying to ignore the nausea swirling around in his stomach as Krista's eyes flew across the page. "Can she do this?" She looked up. Benjamin shrugged. "She already has. I need to call my lawyer. Will you get Maggie ready for bed?" He passed the baby over to Christa, who nodded white-faced and returned the envelope. She brushed his arm lightly, staring up at him intensely. "It'll be okay. I'm sure this is just some big misunderstanding." It was not a misunderstanding. Gina made it clear from the beginning that she wanted to raise Maggie. Benjamin considered himself a fool to assume she had changed her mind. How would she ever have been okay with him taking her granddaughter to England? He watched Krista walk down the hall with the baby as Iris approached. "I've set up the paperwork. We should be able to get the sale finalized by the end of next week," she said to him, oblivious to his new predicament. Her eyes flew to the hall before she leaned in and murmured, "I've set you up with Mr. White to discuss liquidating the ice cream business." Benjamin nodded, his stomach clenching. Even though he had made a promise to Christa and discovered that Joey's was bringing in a lot of business, it didn't stop him from wanting to burn the place down. And nothing would change his mind on that matter.
Christa won't be happy about it, he thought.
In fact, he knew a lot of people in Los Angeles wouldn't be happy, but he couldn't bear to even look at the happy portraits on the walls, constant reminders of happier times, let alone manage a business that would serve as a constant reminder of a tragedy.
"I need you to find the best lawyer who deals with family law and set up a call ASAP."
He handed the letter to Iris, who glanced at it before her brows raised. "I can't say I'm surprised," she said. Then she pinched the bridge of her nose with a huff. "What a headache." Without another word, she marched out of the front door and pulled it to a close behind her. Benjamin's mind was spinning, and his heart grew heavy. He didn't know what hurt more, the constant ache that his brother was gone, or the thought of losing Maggie, too. A couple of hours later, Benjamin sat in the living room. He buried his face in his hands, surrounded by paperwork, with his laptop burning his legs. The fan was whirring away, and the sound competed with the constant ringing in his ears. The prospect of dealing with a lawsuit and going to court sent him mentally over the edge. Now, he was likely going to be stuck in Los Angeles for many months while the legal affairs were dealt with. All the while, he'd be walking the same streets as his brother, living in his house, sleeping in his bed, dealing with all the loose ends and trying not to fall apart. "Hey, I made you some hot cocoa." Christa appeared with 2 steaming mugs. Her long curly hair hung damp below her shoulders, wetting the top of her oversized nightshirt. Her face was fresh and dewy, and she looked at him with sympathy. "Thanks," he said, taking the mug and blowing the hot drink. Christa set her mug on the coffee table and joined him on the couch, tucking her feet under her legs. "Is there anything I can do for you?" She hesitantly reached out and tucked his hair behind his ear. Her fingertips soothed the throbbing in his temples, as if she had healing hands. As she made to move her hand away, he caught it in his grasp and gave her a hungry look. Christa had been teasing him for a fortnight. Every evening, she would join him in the living room, curled up on the couch, wearing something cute or ever so slightly revealing. She would chew her bottom lip and furrow her brows as she played puzzles on her phone, or stroke her thigh absent-mindedly as they watched TV. She gave the impression that she did not realize what she was doing, how tempting she was. But she was the nanny. There was a boundary there, and Benjamin needed to focus on the tasks at hand. He couldn't make a move on the woman who was looking after his niece. It would be highly unprofessional, and if things went south, it would be extremely awkward. So, he would have to find a new nanny, which would be a shame, because he had grown used to having her around. But on that night, the sensible part of his brain had shut down, and a more irrational side took center stage. He had wondered what her lip balm tasted like, if the nape of her neck was as soft as it looked. He wanted to take fistfuls of her wiry curls and inhale the scent of her strawberry shampoo. It could have been the dim lighting reflected in her eyes that pulled him in, or the fact that she sat so close, with the heat radiating off her body and warming him. Benjamin didn't know, but he no longer cared about what he should and shouldn't do. For too long, he had been trying to do the right thing, Too much energy had been invested in keeping everything together, making sure to live up to his promises. Now, he wanted to do something reckless, even if he would regret it in the morning. Without another thought, Benjamin grasped the back of Krista's neck, tracing his thumb along her jawline. She gasped, but made no attempt to draw away. Benjamin took the sign and kissed her cheekbone. It reddened as he pulled back, and Krista's hand found the collar of his shirt. She tugged on it, pulling him in again. "Don't stop," she whispered against his ear, then pressed her lips to his jaw. He moved his head and found her mouth, capturing it with a hard kiss. She moaned against his lips as her hands slid through his hair. Benjamin's body was on fire. All sense of reason or thought abandoned his mind as he kissed Krista. His nose nuzzled against hers, and he buried his hands in her hair. Drips of water ran down his forearms as he took her mouth again and again with maddening hunger. The more they kissed, the more he needed her. But just as he was beginning to think they were going to take things to the next level, Krista's hands pressed on his shoulders, and she tenderly pushed him away. "I can't breathe," she said with a light laugh, resting a hand on her chest. Benjamin smirked. "You take my breath away too," he said. Krista rolled her eyes with a smirk. Then she glanced at his mouth. He could almost hear her thoughts as she fidgeted in the seat, biting her lip and looking at him as if trying to make a decision. Benjamin was just about to make it easy for her and go in for another kiss when she jumped to her feet. He jerked back to stop himself from falling off the couch. "Look, a full moon," she said, pointing out the dark windows. Benjamin didn't care if there were 3 moons outside. All he wanted to do was grab Krista's hand and pull her back onto the couch. He reached for her, but she evaded him with a giggle. "Is it hot in here? I'm burning up. Come on, let's take a walk." Benjamin frowned as Krista wagged a finger at him with a teasing grin. "I'll make it worth your while," she said in a sing-song voice. She picked up her mug and tiptoed out into the hall. Benjamin took a moment to cool down, then grabbed his drink and followed. Christa. Kissing Benjamin was the last thing Krista expected to do, and yet there she was, smooching her boss like she was the next subject posted in a gossip column. She could just picture the headlines. "The Nanny Scandal. Los Angeles woman seduced by grieving billionaire while posing as a nanny." Yet, Krista did steal a few glances at him while wrestling with the urge to make a move, so she was not entirely innocent in the matter. And his lips, so soft. A stark contrast to the scratchy stubble tickling her cheeks. He kissed like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. It sent tingles up her spine just to replay it in her mind. She slid her sandals on, picked up the baby monitor, and led Benjamin out the front door. The sky was so clear, it seemed like every star in the solar system was on show, sparkling and twinkling against a navy blue backdrop. The ocean rolled in and out, letting off a gentle roar, like the sound of a sleeping dragon. "Just look at that moon," she said with a sigh, cradling her mug of hot cocoa. She looked up at the giant orb glowing among the stars and bathed in its ethereal rays. Benjamin stood next to her, his face illuminated. The goofy smile plastered on his face had her smirking. "Don't do that," she said coyly, turning away. Benjamin touched his finger under her chin, and she looked back at him. "Do what?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling from her chest to her toes. "Staring at me? We came out here to look at the moon." "I can't see it." "It's right there." "Nope. Still can't see it." Krista giggled. She stepped out of her sandals and twirled on the spot, then took a long sip of her drink. "Tell me about England." Benjamin turned thoughtful as he looked out at the sea. "It's cold and wet. I don't know what else to say." He chuckled and downed his drink in one. "Did you even taste that?" Krista asked. She set their mugs down and propped the baby monitor up in the sand. Benjamin stooped down and took a handful of sand, then let go. It spilled through his fingers like powder. "British sand is nothing like this," he said. Krista dropped to her knees to join him and eyed his broad hand as he scooped up another fistful of sand. "It's not?" Benjamin shook his head, his dark hair ruffling in the sea breeze. The moonlight reflected in his eyes as he looked at her. "No, it's firm and moist, and sometimes the humidity is so high it's like breathing in syrup, especially when you come from a high altitude." Krista hummed as she considered it. She had never been to England before, but she imagined tiny houses, narrow streets, and lots of rain. Syrup air and moist sand was a new concept. "Do you live by the beach?" she asked, taking another sip of her drink, which was now tepid. "No, I'm in the country. It's just green for miles and miles. Huge oak trees, country lanes, little villages." "Sounds like something from a fairy tale," Krista noted with a nod. Benjamin gave a casual smile. "Maybe." He broke off and glanced at Krista. "Maybe what?" Benjamin shook his head and waved a hand. "Never mind. It's pretty late. I should get some sleep. You should get some sleep, too. Maggie's been waking up early." He rose to his feet and Krista followed, looking at him with bewilderment. One moment he was coming on to her and kissing her with the passion of a wild lion. Now he was standoffish and jumpy. He waved to her, said goodnight, and took long strides back to the beach house, leaving her alone. Krista looked up at the moon, her drink now cold and a hand to her head. "I wonder what that was all about," she said to no one. Sleep did not come easily for Krista as she tossed and turned in the king-size bed. Her mind kept swinging from replays of their heated moments in the living room to the abrupt end to their moonlit walk. Did I say something wrong? Their conversation played on a loop in her mind as she overanalyzed every word they said, which was completely out of character for Krista. She did not get hung up on things. She would go with the flow, keep it cool, and not worry about what he said and she said. And yet, now she was staring up at the high ceiling, wondering how different the night might have turned out had she not pulled away in the living room. Her cheeks warmed and she rolled to her side at the thought of taking things further with Benjamin. No, he was off limits. She was only there to be helpful. "He's grieving. He's irrational. People do crazy things when they're not thinking clearly." When her mother passed away, Krista got a tattoo, which she had always promised she would never do. She believed her body was a temple and tattoos were like graffiti, but she was hurting, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. Krista traced the dragonfly outline on her wrist and chewed her lip. The picture of her mother's face came back to her thoughts, and a giant tear rolled down her face. If Gina won custody of Maggie, it would break Benjamin. She was the only family he had left. But Gina was Maggie's grandma, and she just lost her daughter. How could she stand by and lose her granddaughter, too? Krista rolled onto her back, blinking the tears out of her eyes. "If Benjamin goes back to England, a broken man, I'll have failed him," she whispered to the quiet room. "But if he leaves with Maggie, Gina will be all alone." Weak sunlight poured in through the blinds. Morning was on the horizon, and Maggie would be up soon. Krista wiped her eyes and buried her cheek into the plush pillows. Maybe there's a way to make everyone happy? She allowed the final thought to settle as her mind drifted and her body succumbed to sleep. Benjamin.
Good morning, Benji.
Benjamin rubbed his eyes with a yawn as he sat up in bed. He blinked several times and caught sight of Christa standing in the doorway, bouncing Maggie on her hip. She walked over and he reached out, taking the baby girl in his arms. "Good morning, Maggie Moo." He looked up as Christa beamed at the two of them. Then she leaned over the bed and they kissed. His eyes glanced down at her oversized shirt, the neckline hanging low enough for him to catch a glimpse of just enough cleavage to drive him crazy. Part of him wanted to pull her down and ravage her right there and then, but he looked at Maggie instead, tickling her tummy. "What's on the agenda for today?" he asked, looking at Christa again. She pulled her shirt over her head and began to dress in a pair of jeans. He glanced away, his heart racing as he pulled funny faces at Maggie. She squealed and grabbed his fingers. "I have a 10 a.m. appointment at the salon, then I'm going to the spa with the girls. Then it's afternoon tea at that new place in town. Oh, and I've got this hot date tonight." Benjamin looked back at a fully dressed Christa as she stooped down and planted a cheeky kiss on his lips again. "Oh, yeah? Anyone I know?" he asked, grinning. "Maybe," she replied with a coy smile. A loud crash broke their moment, and before Benjamin could leap out of bed to investigate, Gina barged in. "You just wait until I tell my lawyers about this," she said, her hands on her hips and anger permeating every corner of the room. Benjamin's stomach clenched as she marched over and took Maggie. Christa smiled to Gina, then turned to face Benjamin with a scowl. "What's that look for?" he asked. "You think we can play happy families in England? What an idiot! Maggie is an American. Her family is here." She followed Gina to the doorway, her head held high as Benjamin scrambled out of bed. Maggie began to cry. Her scrunched-up face appeared from above Gina's shoulder, and she stretched out her little hands to Benjamin. "No, please, don't do this. Don't take her away from me." Benjamin fell to his knees as his whole body began to tremble. A giant, claw-like hand clamped over his shoulder and forced him to sink further into the floor. He began to sob. "Maggie, Maggie, no, please." A splash of ice-cold water struck his face and Benjamin jolted awake, his heart racing. "Finally, you're awake." He grabbed a fistful of blanket and mopped his face, then squinted into the blazing sunshine. Christa stood above him, her body surrounded by golden light, giving him a sympathetic look. "You poured water over me," Benjamin said blankly, trying to make sense of the fact. "Sorry about that, but you weren't waking up." "The bed is soaking." Benjamin patted the sheets around him. "What made you think to throw water all over me?" Christa wagged a finger at him. "Hey, I was helping you." "Helping me?" "That's right. You were shouting in your sleep. I tried to wake you up, but you only became more distressed, so I did what they do in movies. And it worked, didn't it?" Christa cocked her head to the side, probably trying to figure him out. Benjamin dragged his hand through his damp hair and huffed. "Right. Thanks," he conceded. Christa's face settled and she smiled at him with approval. "You were having a bad dream, right? I'm good at dream interpretation. Want to tell me about it?" "Not really." Benjamin did not need Christa to analyze his nightmare. He knew what it meant, and he didn't fancy letting her in on it. Before she could argue, a baby cry broke the silence. Christa turned on her heel and bolted out of the door. Now alone, Benjamin dragged himself out of bed and walked to the bathroom, grabbing a towel on the way. Within seconds, the shower was filled with steam, and as he stepped under the hot spray, he sighed. If only a shower could wash his worries away, he thought. But it was not going to be that easy. Gina wanted full custody of Maggie. He would be lying if he said he didn't see it coming, and part of him didn't blame her. Gina was too unwell to travel across state, let alone take a plane to England to visit her granddaughter. Perhaps an arrangement could be made. He could agree to fly Maggie back as much as Gina wanted. He had the jet. He could even hire Krista to help out during visits. But Gina was going for full custody, which was absurd. The old woman struggled to take care of herself full-time. How could she raise a child without any help? He reread his brother's letter in his mind, having looked at it every day for the past 6 weeks.
Ben, Andrea is making us do these letters just in case our trip ends badly. She's such a worrier. But you never know what's around the corner. So, if the unmentionable does happen and you're reading this letter, here's what I've got to say. Firstly, sorry to land you in this mess, baby brother. You've always been the sensible one, and after losing Dad, I know things haven't been easy. I would never ask you to uproot and fill my shoes over here. Dissolve Joey's. I don't want some random businessman taking it over. And sell the house. Andrea and I wish for Maggie to live with you. She has a sizable trust fund, and I know you will make sure she's in the best schools. Take care of her as if she was your own daughter. She loves you. We are aware that Andrea's mother will not be happy with this arrangement. Go easy on her and cut her some slack if she gives you a hard time. She will do anything for Maggie. I know you two will be able to work it out. It's hard to imagine a scenario like this. The thought of my baby girl not having a dad to teach her to ride a bike, or threaten the first boy to break her heart, or walk her down the aisle. If Andrea and I are gone, I need you to take over for me. I know we have our differences, but we're brothers. And if there's one person in the world who can be a good dad for my Maggie, it's you. Take care of yourself, find a good woman to settle down with, and take care of my baby. Joe.
Benjamin stood in the shower for so long that the water grew tepid. He was numb, frozen with his hands resting on the marble tiles as he bowed his head under the shower head. As much as he would have loved to pass the responsibility to Gina and get on with his life, trying to forget about his brother, Benjamin would do anything for his family. He got dressed in a gray suit and stared at the huge number of ties in the closet. "Hey, Christa," he called. A few moments passed, and Maggie wobbled in with Krista close behind.
"Look, Maggie's walking. Did you know she could do that?"
Benjamin knelt down and stretched out his arms as a gleeful Maggie staggered to him.
"Benji,"
she said into his collarbone. His heart warmed at the sound of her voice. "What color tie should I go for?" he said to Krista. She stuck her hip out and furrowed her brows at him. "Huh?" Benjamin pulled two out of the closet and alternated, holding one at his neck. "Red or blue?" Krista crossed her arms and frowned for a moment, then looked down at Maggie, who had crawled back to her legs. She stooped down.
"Has Uncle Benji gone crazy?"
"Why, yes, he has," she said in a baby voice as she stood up again with Maggie on her hip. "I'm going to see Gina today, to see if we can talk things through. Which tie looks more friendly?"
"Is that a serious question? You're wearing a suit to see Gina?"
She lifted her brows. Benjamin's shoulders slumped as he looked at the rows of suits hanging in his closet. Iris had picked up an assortment of clothes for him that were now hanging in the back, but he had not tried them on. It seemed Krista had read his mind when she pushed past him and began to root through the clothes. "Try these." She tossed him a casual blue polo shirt and a pair of light denim jeans. Then she turned to Maggie, who held her hand up to Krista's cheek. "Come on, Maggie. Shall we make some breakfast?" Krista left, Maggie's babbles fading as she walked down the hall. Benjamin dressed quickly and examined himself in the mirror. He tucked his shirt into his jeans, then pulled it out, ruffled his hair, then smoothed it to the side. For Pete's sake, get a grip. Benjamin was never nervous, but now his upper lip was sweaty and he didn't know what to do with himself. He paced the walk-in closet for a few minutes, then pulled on his shoes and marched out. "Are you not going to have breakfast?" Krista said as he walked past the kitchen. Maggie squirmed in her high chair and slammed her fists on the tray, sending pieces of cereal flying. "I'm not hungry. I'll be back this afternoon." He picked up his jacket and headed for the door just as Iris walked in. "Where do you think you're going? Mr. Collins will be here any minute." She tapped the tablet in her hands and gave him a severe look. "Right. I forgot. Reschedule for tomorrow, will you? I have a more pressing matter to take care of." He made to leave, but Iris held her arm out to stop him. "If you're thinking of doing what I think you're doing, I would like to suggest that it is a very bad idea."
"You may suggest it, but I'm still going."
Iris's eyes narrowed at him and she pursed her lips with a hum. "Mr. Collins, your lawyer, will likely advise you to keep all contact in writing from now on." Benjamin patted her on the shoulder and gave a smile.
"I'm going."
Iris's arm fell and she shot him a sour look as he waved at her and left. The limousine pulled up outside a small apartment just as Benjamin was beginning to wonder if he had made an error of judgment. Was Iris right? Was it a bad idea to speak to Gina in person now that this matter was going to court? Maybe he should have had that meeting with Mr. Collins before making a move. He shook his head to himself. "I'm here now. Might as well have a word." He strolled up the path and rapped his knuckles on the white-painted door. "Go away!" He could just make out the muffled old voice. "Gina, I just want to talk. I promise I'm not mad." There was a scuffle and the door edged open an inch, revealing one beady eye. "She's the only family I've got left. I need her here with me." Her voice broke and a sniff followed. The tension in Benjamin's stomach loosened and he sighed. Joe was right. She really would do anything for her granddaughter. He realized this was not a malicious move, but an act of desperation. "I know, and I'll make sure you can see Maggie as much as you want," he said calmly. "Don't be a fool. You think you can send Maggie on a plane twice a week? She'll always have jet lag and never feel settled. She belongs here, with me. Go live your life. You can come and visit her as much as you want. Don't you think that makes more sense?" Benjamin bit his lip. Yes, it did make more sense. He could pay Krista to nanny for Gina when she needed the extra help, and he could visit. It was the best of both worlds. He got to go back to his country manor, living his best single life, and play dad part-time in America. But that was not what Joe wanted, nor Andrea, and he was obligated. "I can't do that," he said frankly. There was a heavy silence, but for a light wheezing from the other side of the door as Gina's eye blinked at him. "Would you come to live here? I've seen the way you look at the nanny. Maybe you could have a life here." Benjamin's jaw stiffened. She couldn't have known about last night, but she picked up on something anyway. Could he live in Los Angeles? The weather was certainly more pleasant, and the breezy sea air seemed to fill his lungs much better than the damp British air. Most of his work could be done remotely,
and he could travel. But then he would be living his brother's life. He was not Joe, and living in Los Angeles would constantly remind him of that. He just couldn't see how it could work.
I can't do that either.
The door opened fully, and Gina scowled at him, tears leaking out of her eyes. Well, I'm not letting you take Maggie thousands of miles away, so I will see you in court. Benjamin opened his mouth, but the door slammed shut. He scratched his stubbled chin and cast his eyes to the ground. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen, but he figured that conversation could have gone a lot better. He slowly walked back to the idling limousine with his head bowed low and his hands in his pockets. Well, Joe, I don't know what to do. Krista. Christa put Maggie down for a nap and was making her way to her room when she heard low voices from behind one of the closed doors along the hall. She pressed her ear to the door and recognized one of the voices, which belonged to Benjamin's assistant, Iris. The sooner we get back to England, the better. This is madness. I told him he should have dealt with this from home. A low male voice replied. He's blinded by his loyalty. What do you think of the nanny? Iris scoffed. I don't like her. Clearly up to something. She's trying to weasel her way into his life, if you ask me. And we can't let that happen. Why not? Because if he moves here, what does that mean for us? You want to move to this ridiculous place? I certainly don't. If we don't do something, we'll both be out of a job. You want me to take care of her? Christa gasped and clamped her hand over her mouth, hoping they didn't hear. No, let me deal with Miss Gold Digger. You just take care of Joey's. Already on it. The sound of footsteps had Christa leaping away from the door, and she hurried to her room, closing the door behind her. What was that all about? She wondered. Iris had not been very nice to her, so she figured that she was unwelcome. But to think she was a gold digger was just outrageous. And why would she think that she was trying to get into Benjamin's life? Yes, last night they crossed a boundary, but Iris didn't even know about that, did she? Iris had spent the evenings in her hotel room across town. Christa cast her eyes around her room looking for hidden cameras. Then she laughed and jogged on the spot. She was jittery and paranoid. The thought that Iris had tapped the house was verging on crazy. Then her thoughts moved to the ice cream parlor. What did they want to do with it? She assumed Benjamin would keep it open, seeing as it was profitable. Or maybe Iris and this mystery man were bad guys and plotted to ruin Benjamin's life. Now Christa really had allowed her imagination to take over. Sleepiness took over as her arms became numb. The restless night mingled with a morning of playtime with Maggie had her bones aching. She climbed onto the bed and allowed her body to sink into the mattress, closing her eyes. All of her paranoid and crazy thoughts faded as she descended into a dreamless sleep. Maggie's cries were far more effective than any phone alarm. It was as if Krista's body had become hardwired to pick up even the faintest cough from Maggie's room. Cries were like alarm bells and had her sitting bolt upright in her bed with her chest heaving. "Coming, Maggie," she called out as she leapt off the bed and hurried to Maggie's room. She walked in to find Maggie, in her pink and yellow romper, standing up at the bars of her crib. Her fingers were curled around the bars, and she yanked on them with a disgruntled groan. Krista's heart warmed. She walked over, lifted the baby, and snuggled her. It amazed Christa how perfectly Maggie fit in her arms, and how comfortable her weight was on her hip. She had become so accustomed to it that she felt off balance without her. The thought of being away from this little girl sent her into panic. She loved Maggie, but that was easy. Maggie had a sweet and gentle temperament, except for when she was tired, teething, hungry, sick, needed a diaper change, or was bored, of course. Krista nuzzled the baby's cheek, and Maggie giggled. "Shall we go for a walk?" she said in her baby voice. Maggie slapped Krista's cheeks with both of her hands, then stuck a thumb in her mouth. Her big baby blues blinked up at her with innocence. Krista nodded. "Let's get you changed." The sun was blazing, but Krista caught sight of rain clouds moving in from a mile away. She picked up her pace and pushed the stroller along the boardwalk of the pier. "Hey, Krista, who's the baby belong to?" Marjorie from number 2 asked, smiling down at Maggie as they approached. Marjorie sat with Thomas from number 4 for their usual ice cream date. Krista always wondered why they never got together. They had both lost their spouse and become close friends. Very close. Yet, the two of them never took things any further. "This is Joey's baby. I'm the nanny while his brother takes care of his affairs." Marjorie's wrinkled hand flew to her chest as she made an exclamation. "Bless her soul." "Have you heard any news about the parlor?" Krista asked. Marjorie and Thomas were regulars. If anyone saw something suspicious, she would know about it. "You tell me. You're the billionaire's nanny, right?" Krista's mouth fell open. Billionaire? Was she talking about Benjamin? She knew he was rich, but never dreamed in a million years he was a billionaire. She didn't know billionaires even existed. "Well, I did see a businessman come in yesterday. He was taking measurements, and if you ask me, he looked like he was doing some sort of survey." "You think they're selling the business?" "Worse. I think they're selling the lot." It took all of Krista's resolve not to look horrified. She instead put on a polite smile and nodded. "Wow. Well, see you around." She made her way into the busy parlor and waved at the 2 teenage boys behind the counter. "Hey, Krista. Haven't seen you around." "Hi, Marty. I got a new job." She gestured at Maggie, who was now reaching out for a child's ice cream cone. "Can I get a chocolate cup for the baby?" "Sure." Marty fixed up an ice cream and handed it to her as she passed him a couple of dollars. "Did you hear the news? We've been given 2 weeks' notice." Krista pushed the stroller around the counter and joined Marty as she eyed the crowd of people waiting in line. "What's happening?" she muttered. Marty ruffled his ginger hair and sighed. "They're dissolving the company, selling the assets. It's all going." Krista pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth to stop the tears from pooling in her eyes. "That's sad," she said finally. Marty gave her a frank smile and nodded. Then he turned away and returned to making ice creams. "Well, thanks for the ice cream." Krista pushed the stroller through the crowd of people and left the parlor just as a rumble of thunder shook the sky. Krista secured the rain cover over Maggie and walked at top speed down the boardwalk. People stood under parasols and in shop doorways as flashes of lightning shot across the darkened sky. Thunderstorms were common in Los Angeles. It was one of the reasons why the heat was so humid. And on an ordinary day, Krista loved getting caught in the rain. She would take off her sandals and jump around on the beach, spinning under the downpour and inhaling the gorgeous smell of wet leaves. But today, she did not dance, nor laugh. But she trudged through the storm, her shoulders heavy and her stomach swirling. "Krista?" She looked up at the sound of her name, blinking raindrops out of her lashes. Benjamin's head was poking out of the limousine parked by the side of the road. "You're soaking wet. Come inside," he shouted, as he got out of the car and hurried to the stroller. Krista didn't want to get in the car with Benjamin. She watched him take Maggie and settle her inside the car as his driver bundled the stroller in the trunk. Benjamin held out his hand for Krista, but she frowned at him. "I'll walk back," she shouted over the storm. Benjamin's slick black hair glistened, and he stooped over, bracing against the downpour as huge drops of water rolled down his gorgeous face. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and care. She wondered how someone so handsome and duty-bound could be so selfish.
"What? Are you crazy? You need to get into the car."
"Yes, I am crazy. Crazy for thinking you'd do the decent thing." Christa turned and began to walk away. "I'll see you back at the house," she called over her shoulder as she folded her arms.
"Christa, what are you doing? Just get in the car."
Benjamin grasped her arm, but she shook him away. "I took Maggie to get ice cream today," she said. Benjamin's face fell, and he glanced back at the car. "So it's true, then? You're still closing down Joey's?" Benjamin rubbed the back of his neck and looked at her with a guilty smile.
"Look, it's difficult. Business is cutthroat."
"Don't patronize me," Christa snapped. "Don't feed me some lie that it's all about business when we both know it's not." Another rumble of thunder filled the sky. Christa wasn't sure if it was the storm that gave her the courage to speak to Benjamin this way. He was her boss, after all. Yes, they shared a moment last night, a moment that Benjamin appeared to be able to forget ever happened. But Christa shouldn't be shouting at him. She wasn't even sure why it bothered her so much. Didn't he tell her from the beginning that he was just here to tie off loose ends and take his niece home to England?
"Just come into the car and we can talk,"
Benjamin said, waving to the limousine. Christa wondered if Maggie was okay sitting in the back. "What am I doing? I should be with her." Christa nodded faintly and followed Benjamin. He held the door for her as she climbed in. Maggie sat in her car seat, sucking her thumb. Her mouth, hands, and romper were completely covered in melted chocolate ice cream, though she didn't seem to mind. An empty cup lay on the floor. In the heat of their argument, Christa had forgotten all about the ice cream. She hurried to Maggie's side and grabbed some wet wipes from the diaper bag.
"Oh dear," Benjamin said as he closed the door.
Christa refused to look back as she did her best to clean up the mess, and the car rolled forward.
"Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Benjamin asked.
Christa shot him a look. "Not here. Not now." She jerked her head in Maggie's direction and looked pointedly at Benjamin. His brows raised, and he nodded as if he had caught on to her thoughts. She didn't want to argue in front of the baby. Christa believed that experiences could attach themselves to parts of the body. If they had a fight in front of Maggie, she might not remember it later on, but her body would, and she didn't need any more trauma in her life. Losing her mom and dad was bad enough. They sat in silence, dripping onto the leather seats as they waited for the car to pull up outside the beach house. Christa tried to ignore the fact that she could see the firm outline of Benjamin's pectorals through his polo shirt, and she bit her tongue hard to stop her mind from thinking about wrapping her arms around his drenched shoulders and clasping her hands behind his neck. She glanced at the stubborn raindrop clinging to his bottom lip. Even when she was mad at him, she still found him irresistibly hot. And Christa wasn't sure if that annoyed her or excited her. Benjamin. Christa was acting strange, and Benjamin couldn't fully work out why. He knew she wouldn't like the fact that Joey's was closing down, but he never expected her to behave like this. He had always heard the term fiery redhead, but never experienced firsthand what that meant. And oh boy, did he like it. Christa was soaked to the bone. Her shirt clung to her body like a second skin, leaving little to the imagination. He did his best to avert his eyes, but Krista's ample bosom was distracting. He pulled a jacket out from underneath his seat and handed it to her, but she shot him a dark look and pouted in a way that made him weak at the knees. He didn't even know what he'd done to make her so furious. Part of him didn't even care. He liked this side of Krista. He wondered what else he could do to irritate her, just so he could see her sunny disposition transform into an outrageously gorgeous glare. He followed her into the house and watched as she lowered Maggie into the playpen and then swiveled on the spot to see Benjamin staring at her. "You're shivering. Let me get you a towel." He hurried to the hall and returned with a stack of fluffy towels. Krista wrapped one around herself and chewed her lip. "We're not done talking, but we need to shower and change clothes first," she said. Benjamin cocked a brow at her with a wry smile. "Separate showers. You go and shower in your bathroom, and I'll be in the main bathroom. Alone," she added. Benjamin took his second shower of the day, but this time jumped in and out as fast as he could. He hurriedly dressed into his most casual suit pants and threw another polo shirt on. Then he dashed to the living room. Maggie was playing in her pen, talking to her toys, oblivious to all the worries swirling around in his head. Happy she was safe, he walked towards Krista's room. He knocked gently. "Come in." He pushed the door open to find Krista bent over, ruffling a towel through her damp hair. She flipped up and looked at him brazenly, and for a moment, he forgot she was mad at him. He grinned foolishly, which only seemed to annoy her even more. "Don't do that," she snapped. Benjamin's smile faded as he nodded. "Okay, talk to me. What's on your mind?" He pulled up a chair from the dressing table as Krista sidled to the bed and sat down. "I took this job because I wanted to help you through a hard time. Don't think I've forgotten that you're grieving." She sighed and looked out of the large windows. The storm had passed and a flood of sunshine settled on her face. She sparkled like a goddess with damp, fiery red hair fanned across her shoulders. Benjamin's mouth went dry. "And when you promised that you'd think about keeping Joey's open, I thought you'd change your mind." She looked back at him and crossed her legs. "Look, I'm just doing what's best," he said heavily. "For who?" Krista shot back with her hands on her hips. "You? Because taking Maggie back to England, selling this house, and closing Joey's, it's like... She broke off and looked down. "Like what?" Benjamin pressed, not following. Krista looked at him again, her eyes moist. "It's like you want to remove every trace of your brother from this place. Like he never existed." Ouch. Benjamin rubbed the ache in his chest as he took in the weight of her words. From her point of view, he was being heartless. He could see that now. "I'm just carrying out his wishes," he said, his throat constricting. Krista shook her head. "I don't believe you. I think you're taking the easy route." Benjamin stood up. "The easy route," he repeated. "You think all this is the easy route? I could have had my lawyers take care of everything. I could have let them put Maggie in care until the legal work was done and then have her sent to Gina. You think this is easy for me? To be here, in his house?" Benjamin paced the room as tears welled in his eyes. The thought of an upcoming legal battle with Gina did not upset him nearly as much as the thought of Krista thinking he was being selfish. "All I've ever done is look after my family, putting their needs above my own. When my brother ran off to live his fairy tale life, I supported him. When our mother ran off with her yoga instructor, I helped my father pick up the pieces. And when he was on his deathbed, I was the one holding his hand, not Joe. Now I'm here, trying to do what he told me to do." Benjamin stopped talking and looked hard at the floor with his jaw clenched. He was done with the crushing pain in his chest, tired of the tears that were never far away, sick of the throbbing pain in his temples. All he wanted to do was make Christa see he wasn't as awful as she thought he was. Then, an idea struck him. He looked up and caught sight of Christa sitting on the bed, staring at him with a mixture of guilt and sympathy. "Wait here," he said. She nodded silently and he ran out of the room. When he returned, he handed her the crumpled letter that he had thrown in the waste paper basket. "Read it," he instructed. Then he walked to the window as Christa studied the letter. The sea was calm and a deep shade of blue in the glorious sunshine. It was difficult to believe the world could be so beautiful and serene when a storm continued to rage within his body. "Aha!" Benjamin turned at the unexpected exclamation to find Christa on her feet. She pointed at the letter in her hand and tapped it with her finger. "He wanted you to stay here." Benjamin frowned. "No, I have memorized every word. He didn't say that." Christa rolled her eyes and brandished the letter. "Look closer. See this line? I wouldn't ask you to come here and live my life. That totally means he wanted you here." Benjamin stared at Christa incredulously. "He literally says he wouldn't ask me to do that." "Come on, Benjamin, think. He's saying he wouldn't ask you because it's a big ask. He's already making you look after his kid. He's thinking it'll be easier for you to get rid of everything because he thought you'd never move here. And the most important thing is that his little girl is with his uncle." Benjamin's brow pinched together as he tried to make sense of what Christa was saying. "So, you're saying that Joe would prefer I live in his house, raise his kid, and run his ice cream parlor?" Christa patted him on the shoulder, her face breaking into a smile. "Now you get it," she said with a sigh. "Look, I'm sorry I overreacted. I didn't realize you were trying to do the right thing. I should have known better." She stroked his arm. The touch sent his senses into a frenzy. "When I lost my mom, I thought I'd never be happy again. And I'm pretty sure I made some dumb mistakes. Who knows, maybe I did kill Poofy." Benjamin looked at her with confusion. "What?" Christa let go of his arm and began to pace the room, ignoring his look of confusion. "But, you know what got me through?" She looked at him pointedly. Benjamin shrugged. "Crystals?" he asked innocently. She always seemed to be wearing them. Christa walked up to him again and took his hand. "Family, Benjamin. Family." She touched his chest with the palm of her hand, and for a moment, her eyes lingered on his lips. Benjamin wanted to close his eyes and savor the moment forever. "I thought your mother was the only family you had?" he asked. He was trying to ignore the rush of heat flooding throughout his entire body at her touch. Christa's cheeks lifted as she bit her lip. Then she grinned widely at him. "Come on, let me show you." She tugged on his hand and Benjamin let the paper fall as he followed her lead. Bewildered and with no idea what she had in mind, he couldn't help but smile too. Christa. "Pull over here," Christa said to the driver. She tickled Maggie's tummy and spoke to her in a baby voice as the car came to a stop. Benjamin sat quietly, tapping away on his phone in deep concentration. "Okay, we're here." Christa removed Maggie from her car seat and followed Benjamin. They stepped out in front of a large community center that overlooked the beach. "Why are we here?" Benjamin asked. Christa tapped her nose and fastened Maggie in her stroller. "It's 4 p.m. Salsa time." She ignored the incredulous look on Benjamin's face and led him in through the double doors to the center. They found the main hall, and as Benjamin opened the door for her, she grinned at him, sidling past. The main hall was full of elderly couples attempting to dance in beat to the Latin music pumping from the speakers. A Latina woman dressed in vibrant colors shimmied her hips and barked instructions at the couples. The woman's painted lips curled upwards into a glittering smile when her eyes landed on Krista. "Come and join us, will you?" she said. Krista parked the stroller at the edge of the room and offered a hand to Benjamin, who looked like a fish out of water. "What's the matter? Never danced with a woman before?" she teased. Benjamin's pale face grew pink, and he took her hand. "What are we doing?" he muttered into her ear as he took her hand. The Latin music had Krista swaying her hips instinctively. She took his hand and placed it on her hip, while gripping his other hand firmly to the side. "Just follow my lead." Benjamin did as he was told and kept his eyes on her feet as he mirrored her steps. They sashayed to the left. Krista twirled, gripped his back, and then bent over backwards. Then they sashayed to the right. Benjamin caught on to the moves faster than she expected. Soon enough, the two of them were in their own world, dancing to the upbeat music. His hand squeezed her waist, and his other wrist forcefully rotated to make her twirl. Krista wasn't sure when it changed, but he was definitely leading now. His eyes lit up as they met each other's gaze and lost themselves in the dance. Krista thought there was something magical about dancing. Two souls working in perfect harmony, becoming part of a song. Their breaths became in sync, and Benjamin's broad grin matched hers. They picked up the pace as the music upped its tempo, and a random fit of laughter took over Krista's whole body. Benjamin swooped her to the side and bent over her as she leaned back and pointed her toe with her leg stretched out. His face hovered tantalizingly close to hers, so much so that his breath tickled her cheeks. She wasn't laughing anymore. There was nothing even remotely amusing about this pose. They stayed like that for seconds, but it could have been hours for all Krista knew. Her breath caught in her chest, and suddenly the events of the previous night came flooding back to the forefront of her mind. How easy it would have been to lean in and capture him with a kiss. But just as the thought crossed her mind, Benjamin loosened his grip a little and pulled her up to a stand. A flood of applause took over her hearing. She looked around at a sea of familiar faces and grinned. "That was beautiful. The chemistry between you two is electric," the dance teacher said. She held out her hand to Benjamin, her teeth gleaming at him. "I'm Rosita. And you are?" "Benjamin." A flurry of excited voices followed his reply, even as Krista noticed several of the elderly gentlemen rolling their eyes in a not-so-subtle way. Some of them tutted. "Well, it's a treat to have you two join us today. Tell me, where have you been hiding this man, Christa?" Suddenly, the room exploded with questions as the couples crowded them. Benjamin shot her a look as he shook hands with everyone and politely nodded with a smile. Krista's plan was backfiring. Okay, you're all excited, I know, but give poor Benjamin some room to breathe," she said, raising her hands. A couple of old ladies gathered by the stroller and cooed over Maggie as Krista waded through the crowd to join her. "You two look so happy together. It's marvelous to see." The comments came flying from all directions. "Isn't it nice to see Krista with a man? How did you two meet? When is the wedding?" The questions became more and more obtrusive, and Krista's stomach knotted. One of the gentlemen, Robert, prodded Benjamin's chest and gave him a steely look. "Now, listen here, young man. If you break our girl's heart, we'll all come after you." Another man, hunching over a cane, walked forward and waved it in the air at him. "We might be old, sonny, but we know how to use these." It was the ladies' turn to roll their eyes now. "For goodness sake, Albert, give the poor boy a break." Benjamin's face warmed and he inclined his head gentlemanly.
I apologize for interrupting your class, Rosita, he offered, gesturing to the teacher who was knelt by Maggie, talking to her in a high-pitched voice. She waved a hand over her shoulder and did not turn at the sound of her name.
We've known Krista since she was just a babe, Valerie from number 14 said to Benjamin. She and 3 other ladies remained at his side and proceeded to take turns sharing stories about Krista. Benjamin appeared to show polite interest as he nodded along with a thoughtful expression on his face. He hummed and said, "Oh, really?" at all the right moments. Krista smirked. She pictured him in a boardroom listening to a team of businessmen droning on about projections and GDP indexes. "Well, we better go," Krista said a little too loudly. Protests filled the air as the old couples turned to face her once more. "Do stay. Rosita hasn't even cut the cake yet."
"Cake? I thought this was a salsa lesson," Benjamin said with his brow cocked.
Valerie chuckled. "Most of us just turn up for the free food." She took a raspy breath. "And the company, of course," she added, gesturing at the rest of the people. Krista tugged on Benjamin's arm and took the stroller. "We'd love to stay, but we have to be somewhere. See you later." She flashed her teeth as a harmony of goodbyes followed them out of the door. Once in the hall, Benjamin gave Krista the oddest look. She couldn't read him. Was it amusement? Did he think she was crazy? Or was it something else? She wished she could read his mind. But the moment had passed and he looked away.
"Well, that was interesting,"
he said finally. Krista dropped her shoulders in defeat. She wanted to show him what it was like to be part of a community, but instead, he was thrown into a chaotic situation and forced to listen to her elderly neighbor's stories for 40 minutes. She nipped her bottom lip with her teeth and stopped walking. Then she turned to apologize to Benjamin. But before she could open her mouth, Benjamin slid his arms around her back, grabbed fistfuls of her hair, and gave her the best kiss of her life. Benjamin. Benjamin was not thinking clearly. He was making out with his nanny in broad daylight, and his baby niece was watching with her thumb stuck in her mouth. Maggie's wide eyes were glued on him as he broke apart from Krista, and a flush of heat warmed his face. He took a deep breath and resisted the urge to take her in for another kiss. Instead, he studied Krista's face. Pink speckles had appeared on her cheeks, and he could see every single one of her teeth as she grinned at him. "What was that for?" she asked breathlessly. Benjamin licked his lips, tasting her berry-flavored lip gloss. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. It was as if he had been walking around with a dark rain cloud above his head until Christa came along, like a ray of sunshine. "Come to England with me," he blurted. Krista's mouth hung open. "What?" Benjamin glanced at the crowds of bystanders watching them and motioned for them to keep walking. "Come with me to England. Be my nanny. I'll pay you triple what you're on now, and you can live in my manor." He opened the car door for Krista, but she folded her arms and looked at him with glistening eyes. "You've got to be kidding me." Benjamin frowned as he took Maggie out of the stroller and bobbed her in his arms. "Is that what you do, Benjamin? Buy people?" Krista shot him a fiery look. "How dare you!" Benjamin followed her into the car with Maggie in tow and closed the door behind him. The engine rumbled and the jet-black limousine pulled away as he fastened Maggie's belt. And just like that, the dark cloud was back. He caught sight of Krista staring at him, as if in shock as he settled back in his seat. "You kissed me. Now you're offering me money to live with you?" Her question set off alarm bells in his head.
Well, when you put it that way, he thought. I didn't mean...
What? You didn't mean to kiss me or buy me? Benjamin chewed his lip and considered the minefield he had found himself having to navigate. Yes, he did mean to kiss her, and no, he was not trying to buy her, but somehow the question felt like a trap. He didn't know what to say as Christa eyed him shrewdly. Benjamin had become so caught up in his emotions that he didn't stop and consider his actions. After watching Christa speak to the elderly couples with such sweetness, he wanted to scoop her up in his arms and hold her as tight as he could. She was respectful, but jovial at the same time, and the way she laughed heartily at the old men's jokes had his heart soaring. The love emitting from everyone overwhelmed him. There was no doubt that Christa was a treasured part of the community. She was exactly the type of woman he needed in his life. Genuine, kind, witty, and she did not have a selfish bone in her body. He needed her in England. Perhaps kissing her and offering her a job right after might not have been the best plan in the world. The two actions did send mixed signals. But he wondered what she expected. Did she think he would ask her to move in with him and start a relationship? But how could he maintain a professional relationship with her when all he wanted to do was ravish her at every chance?
"You're great with Maggie," he said finally. "And I'll need a nanny when I get home. Don't you think it'll be good for Maggie to have some stability?"
Christa looked at him incredulously. "You're going to talk about what's best for Maggie? Really? Well, you seem more than happy to take her away from her grandma. Did you completely miss the point of coming here?" Benjamin closed his mouth and studied her narrowed eyes. Why did she bring him to the salsa class? His mind went blank. Benjamin reasoned that his face must have matched his thoughts because Christa snorted and shook her head to herself. "Don't you get it? I'm Maggie." Benjamin cocked his head to the side and raised his brows.
"I'm not following," he said.
Christa rolled her eyes and looked out the window.
"Never mind," she whispered.
Benjamin wanted to press her on it, ask her to explain all of life's mysteries. She seemed so sure of herself and confident about the big questions. If he could tap into that beautiful mind for a day, he could only imagine what he might discover. But before Benjamin could ask a question, his phone vibrated.
"Ah."
He looked up at Christa, who looked puzzled by his reaction. He tapped on his phone.
"That's my lawyer."
And just like that, his hopes and dreams came crashing down as he faced a brutal reality. That he was never going to have Christa in his life for good. Just the thought made him nauseous. Christa. The next 2 weeks passed by in a blur of awkwardness and confusion. Christa saw less and less of Benjamin as he spent so much time in his office on calls or out meeting his lawyer. Iris made a point to show her satisfaction that he was giving Christa the cold shoulder. Whatever her plan was, it must have been working. When Benjamin was in the same room, he would bury his attention on his phone or busy himself with menial tasks, like emptying the trash or washing the dishes, which was odd to Christa because he had paid help and didn't need to do them. Something made him take a U-turn after their trip to the community center. If only she could work out what it was. Yes, Christa knew she did not take his offer well, but he had just kissed her with every ounce of passion, leaving her breathless and weak at the knees, then landed her with a job offer. She expected a declaration of love and nothing less. Not after that kiss. The most heartbreaking change was that Benjamin no longer played with Maggie at dinner or helped with bath time. Over the last week, he had barely even laid eyes on her. Krista overcompensated by giving Maggie even more attention. She gave her ice cream for breakfast because she was teething, carried her everywhere, even though she could walk quite confidently now, and she read not one, not two, but 3 bedtime stories, complete with actions and over-the-top impersonations. Krista's heart ached every time she stopped and watched while Maggie had her bottle, or when Maggie looked up in wonderment at the bubbles floating from her bath. The child's whole world had turned upside down. This beautiful soul had lost her parents, and she was too young to understand it now, but one day she would have to deal with that. Gina continued to take Maggie on Tuesdays and came for dinner on Sundays. She acted amicable and friendly in person, but the correspondence from her lawyer grew more and more aggressive. Christa overheard Benjamin ranting on the phone to his lawyer from the office. When Maggie was with Gina, Christa took the opportunity to get away and spend some time at her apartment. Rodney, her chameleon, walked over her legs as she sat on her bed watching Netflix and consuming copious amounts of ice cream. By the 3rd Tuesday, Christa had gained a few pounds and needed to buy new shorts. Either that, or stop indulging in salted caramel ice cream. She scrolled through the different TV shows, looking for something to binge as she lay on the bed, bloated and miserable. Her crystals sat forgotten on her nightstand, collecting dust, and her candles had not been lit for over a month. A sudden bang from the hall had her leap off the bed. Rodney gave her a look of contempt as he swaggered to her pillow and huddled in a ball, basking in the warm spot where she had been sitting. "Hey, Hank, are you okay?" Christa said as she opened the door. Her eyes flew to the floor to find the old man sprawled out awkwardly with his cane laying a couple of feet away.
"Blasted hip," he grumbled. Christa stooped down and took one of his arms.
"Come on, let me help you up," she said, getting him back to his feet. This was not the first time she had to help a resident after a fall. The first few times she had dialed 911, but she soon learned how the paramedics would help them up and became a pro at it. "What were you up to? Running a marathon?" Christa asked as she handed Hank his cane and they walked slowly into his apartment.
"I wanted to see if I could walk without this."
He glared at the cane in his hand as if it was an imposter. "Now, why would you do that?" He collapsed into the musty armchair by a window and lifted his feet to rest on a small footstool. "Do you want me to make you a coffee?" she asked. Hank nodded as he coughed into his handkerchief and waved his hand.
"Well, if you must know, I have a date this weekend."
Christa bit against a smile as she refilled the coffee filter. "Oh? Well, that's got to be the first date since—"
"Exactly,"
he finished. They shared a look of mutual understanding. Hank had been alone for as long as Christa could remember. When he lost his wife Eileen, he promised to be alone for the rest of his life. She wondered what made him feel ready to find love again after so many years.
"It's a foolish goal, I know, but I wanted to put on a suit, buy a bunch of flowers, and take a nice lady to dinner, without hobbling along with this stick."
Christa prepared his drink and carefully rested it on a coaster on the small table by his chair. Then she perched on the edge of his seat and clasped her hands together. Hank proceeded to tell Christa all about his lady friend, sparing no details on how they met and who said what. He could even describe the purple stitching on her chiffon blouse and the scent of her perfume that took him back to the 60s. "Sounds like you've found someone special," Christa mused, her cheeks lifting despite the hollowness in her chest. Hank sipped his drink and studied her over the cup.
"The ladies tell me you found yourself a British businessman," he said, averting his eyes as he blew into the steaming mug.
"Oh, no, there's nothing there," Christa said. Just saying the words hurt a little. She picked her cuticles, avoiding his steady gaze, worried that if she allowed him to look into her eyes, he'd see right through the lie.
What happened? All I've heard is you two were quite taken with each other at the Salsa club.
Krista's heart squeezed at the memory of Benjamin hovering over her as she leant backwards in his arms. In some ways, it felt like a whole lifetime had passed since that day. And now Benjamin would not even look in her direction, let alone hold her hand or graze her cheek. Oh, how she longed to feel the weight of his hand on her skin once more, or see his baby blues sparkling again. She never did work out why he had such a change in attitude. Why did he pull away? She bit her lip and glanced at Hank, who was still looking at her, blinking slowly. There was no sense of urgency. He merely sipped his drink and waited. "It's complicated," she said with an exhale.
"I've heard that before."
He cradled his mug and nodded for her to continue. "Okay," Christa said, sitting up straight. She proceeded to tell Hank all about Benjamin, Maggie, and Gina. She started with the news that Benjamin was the brother of the man who owned Joey's. He had flown over to take care of the state affairs and look after his niece. But the baby's grandmother was fighting for sole custody. She glossed over the details of their passionate kisses one night, then filled him in on the salsa lesson. "We were just leaving when he suddenly kissed me," she said, waving her hands to add drama to the statement. "Then he offered to pay me to live with him in England." She stopped to take a long breath, realizing she had been speaking so fast she wasn't sure she had taken a moment to draw in any air. Hank hummed as he slid his tongue across his thin lips and scratched his chin. I obviously didn't appreciate being bought, so I let him know that was inappropriate." She wriggled in her seat and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as Hank squinted with his eyes looking up. It was as if he was trying to make out minuscule writing on the ceiling.
"Interesting,"
he muttered. Christa nodded as her mind caught up to the present. "Then he just grew cold. He started to avoid me, leaving the room when I enter. He won't talk to me, and now he won't even look at Maggie." Hank nodded as he dragged his hand across his face with a sigh.
"He's disengaging,"
he said with a shrug. Christa frowned at him. "I'm sorry. What?" Hank barked into his handkerchief and dabbed his mouth with it.
"He's concerned he's going to lose both you and the baby, so he's disengaging. It's a self-preservation tactic that's very common."
"But that doesn't make any sense," Christa burst out, jumping to her feet. "Why would he push us away because he's scared of losing us?" Hank raised a brow at her with a smirk.
"My girl, I said it was common, not smart."
The corner of Krista's mouth twitched at his comment. Then she crossed her arms. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, looking at Hank expectantly.
"Do you like Benjamin?"
Christa fidgeted on the spot. "When he's not being an idiot. Sure," she said, a smile creeping across her face. Hank nodded with a deep hum.
"Talk to him. Tell him exactly what you want."
Christa threw her hands in the air. "I tried that already. He didn't get it." Hank shook his head and raised a finger in the air.
"No, you were not straight with him."
"But I took him to the community center, and I said I was Maggie. How could I make myself clearer?"
"Christa, even I have no idea what you mean by that."
He chuckled and glanced out of the window before turning back to Christa, who returned to her seat. She played with her hair as she thought about it. "I lost my parents at a young age, but I have this big old family who love me. I wanted him to see that Maggie needs that. He needs that. And he could have it all if he stays here." Hank's shoulders shook as he chortled.
My, he said between breaths. Men are not mind readers. You need to tell him that. Exactly that.
Krista looked at him, as if seeing the old man for the very first time. She wondered how she could have been so foolish. "You don't think it's too late?" she asked, rising to her feet. A bubble of excitement was growing in her midriff. Hank waved at her.
Life is too short to hang about. Go and get your man.
Krista dashed for the door, but halted and turned. "You sure you don't need me to call someone?" she asked, biting her lip. Hank shook his head.
I'm fine. Just go.
Krista had become so consumed by her grand plan to win Benjamin's heart and persuade him to stay in Los Angeles that she made it halfway to the beach house before she realized that Rodney was still roaming free in her apartment. It took an hour to find him, hiding between the bed and the wall, and return him to the vivarium. She told him all about the plan, to which he merely rolled his eyes and climbed up to his favorite basking spot on his hammock. Krista knew exactly what to do. She had seen more than a few romantic comedies to know how this would play out. She would race to the beach house, barge into his office just as he was wrapping up a very important meeting with his esteemed colleagues. Then, she would declare her feelings for him, making him equally embarrassed and relieved. And she'd beg him not to go back to England. Then he would say something cheesy like, "I thought you'd never ask," and pick her up in his broad arms and swoop her around in a circle. Krista couldn't help but grin ear to ear as she pushed open the front door of the beach house and marched through the house with her shoulders squared and heart pounding. She was moving so fast, her head was still spinning, and there was not enough time for nerves to kick in. "Benjamin, I need to talk to—" She jolted and came to a stop as Iris opened the office door and stood in her way. "I need to see Benjamin." Iris's eyes narrowed and her thin lips curled up as she hummed. "You've just missed him, but I'm glad you're here. Benjamin has asked me to give you this." She handed Krista a small brown envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Your final paycheck. Your services are no longer required," she said curtly. Krista could sense she was enjoying every moment of this. "Wait, this is a joke. Let me speak to Benjamin." Krista tried to push by, but Iris held out a hand. "He's boarding a plane as we speak." "But what about Gina? The legal stuff. He can't just take Maggie." "The child is staying with her grandmother. Not that it's any of your business. Benjamin and Mrs. Gray were able to come to a mutual agreement outside of court. Now, if you don't mind, this house is sold, and I need you to pack up your belongings and leave immediately." Krista stared at Iris, stunned and frozen on the spot, as if waiting for her to burst out with laughter and say, "Just kidding." But as the moment lingered and Iris's stare only grew colder, the sickening realization that this was not a joke was beginning to hit her. "He's gone?" she said with defeat. Just like that, Benjamin had left without saying goodbye, and he hadn't taken Maggie with him. She was too late. Maybe the reality was she would never have changed his mind. This sudden move could have been brewing for a long time, and Krista had just refused to see it. She walked past Maggie's vacant room, and her heart sank as she glanced at the empty crib. The thought of never seeing her baby face again, or feeling the weight of her sitting on her hip, made a lump form in Krista's throat. Sure, she knew the arrangement was temporary, but to end it all so abruptly was an even colder move than she could ever expect of Benjamin. She packed her bag in record time and did not so much as wave at Iris as she bolted for the door. The setting sun cast an orange glow over the beach as Krista walked out onto the sand. The limousine was gone. So were the security guards who usually stood outside the door. As tears welled in her eyes, Krista was surprised that she even missed Benjamin's formal entourage. She yanked on the strap of her bag at her shoulder and trudged back to the main road. She had been so full of adrenaline and excitement. Now, it was as if her bubble of hope had fallen to the pit of her stomach like a lead balloon. She left the private beach and walked along the road, amongst the hustle and bustle of happy tourists going about their day, oblivious to the sound of her heart shattering into a million pieces. She missed him, and she wanted to snuggle Maggie. But Benjamin wasn't coming back, and Gina would never let her see Maggie again. Benjamin returned from his weekly game of squash, drenched in sweat. He dabbed the white towel on his neck and took a greedy swig of water as he headed for the shower. It was good to be home. The chilly air prickled his bare skin, bringing the hairs on his arms to a stand, and the wind rushing through the trees reminded him of the tide coming in and out. As he returned from the shower, now smelling strongly of menthol, he noticed the sky had become a deep shade of violet. He secured a towel around his waist and shook his head, spraying beads of water across the marble flooring. Then he headed for the balcony. Somewhere in the distance, a wood pigeon cooed, and another responded to it. The world was right again. Normal. He was back on British soil, recovered from jet lag, living in his country manner, staying away from everything. He knew he had done the right thing by signing over guardianship of Maggie to Gina. They decided that he would send over money for Gina to get childcare if needed, and he would visit Maggie as often as he could. Leaving without saying goodbye to Christa hurt, but not as much as it would have if he saw her again. He had crossed a line, more than once. Of course, she couldn't be his nanny, not now that he had developed feelings for her. He wondered if he gave her some time and allowed the dust to settle, he could give her a call. Or would she never forgive him for freezing her out and then getting Iris to fire her? As he thought about it, his stomach lurched. It was a spineless move. But he had had other things on his mind. The sale of the beach house had finally come together, but Gina's lawyers were constantly on his back. She even threatened to take the scandal to the papers. He didn't want Maggie to have to deal with the fallout. What if she came across the media coverage when she was grown up? He wouldn't allow it. She had enough to deal with. As for the ice cream business, he was undecided. Something nagged at his mind after Christa questioned the meaning behind Joe's letter. Did he really prefer Benjamin to move to Los Angeles and run his business? Take on his whole life? The books were looking good, and he entrusted the workers hired by Joe to keep the place running until he decided what to do. He leant against the balcony, ignoring the whip of ice-cold air ruffling his hair. The sky grew dark, and tiny specks of light twinkled down at him. What would Joe want? Christa made a valid point. If he got rid of the business, it would be like erasing Joe from the face of the planet, like he never existed. The terrible thought made him clench his jaw. What if he found a way to honor Joe and Andrea? He thought about the picture on the wall at Joey's of the two of them outside the parlor. He wanted Maggie to grow up knowing her parents. Then an idea hit him. He walked back into his room and picked up his phone. "Iris, it's me. Have you boarded the plane yet? Great. I need you to stay in Los Angeles for a few more days and set up some calls." "Well, Mr. Harris, congratulations. Joey's is now a franchise. Do you have any people in mind to work with?" Benjamin crossed his legs and cradled the cup of coffee in his hands as he smiled out of the window. He had just signed the paperwork to bring his ideas to fruition, and he couldn't remember ever feeling so good.
I have some contacts who may be interested. I want there to be a Joey's ice cream parlor every 100 kilometers on the whole coast by 2025.
The man nodded with a look of amusement to wash his narrow face.
I admire your ambition, and if there's anyone to make that happen, it's you,
he said, shuffling the papers on his desk. Benjamin smirked as the two men rose to a stand and shook hands.
Keep in touch, Paul. Thank you for your assistance.
As Benjamin strode out of the London office, he felt like $1 million. Red double-decker buses rolled by, and he flagged down one of the hundreds of black cabs.
"Where to?"
the driver asked, glancing back at Benjamin. His heavy-set eyes widened as he recognized him.
"Are you Benjamin Harris?"
he asked quickly. Benjamin nodded. The driver fumbled with his phone and held it up to take a selfie.
"Do you mind?"
he asked, gesturing to the phone.
"My sister follows you on Instagram, and she'll die when she finds out I drove you today."
Benjamin took a selfie with the driver and listened to the man's whole life story while they navigated the busy London streets. There was no such thing as rush hour in the city. Driving a couple of miles would easily take over an hour, giving George, the cab driver, plenty of time to overshare. Not that Benjamin minded.
"And my girlfriend, she's a bit nuts, actually. She's always buying these crystals and has them all over the house. But how weird is this, right? This morning, she told me I'd drive someone famous across the city. And you got in my car. I tell you what, I think she's on to something. Maybe everything does happen for a reason. Maybe there really is a plan."
George smiled triumphantly to himself as he looked out at the road. Benjamin's smile faded as Christa's face came to the forefront of his mind. His stomach panged, and he ached in a way he had never known before. It had been almost a month since their trip to the community center, 2 weeks since he set foot on the white sand of the Gold Coast. He couldn't even remember the last time she smiled at him. The truth was, England no longer gave him joy. He tried to settle back into his old routine, took a couple of women out for dinner, went clay pigeon shooting with his old school friends, and played tennis twice a week. But his life seemed bland. Even the food lost its taste. Setting up Joey's as a franchise gave him a sense of purpose again. He was not just funding a struggling business, or propping up an overly enthusiastic entrepreneur to get a jump start in life. He was continuing his brother's legacy. But he didn't want to do it alone. Benjamin was not a religious man, although he had been forced to attend church for his entire school life. But as his thoughts turned to Christa, he decided to offer up a prayer to God. He wasn't even sure there was a God, but just in case life wasn't random and that there was a master plan for him, maybe, he figured, he could ask the question. Am I supposed to make a life in America? As if the heavens had opened, a stream of brilliant light flooded his vision from the window, and his phone vibrated in his pocket. He rubbed his eyes and pulled out his phone. "Benjamin Harris speaking," he said, blinking the white spots out of his eyes, unable to read the name of the caller.
"Benjamin? It's Gina. Listen, I think I've made a terrible mistake. We need to talk."
Christa. Life without Benjamin and Maggie was a lot less meaningful for Christa, but the only silver lining was that Joey's had not shut down. In fact, she was able to get her old job back. Seeing the happy children coming into the parlor and choosing their ice cream softened the pain in her heart, but only briefly. She spent many nights scrolling through Benjamin's social media profiles. Once the word got out that he had plans to put Joey's on every beach in America, in memory of his brother, the whole world fell in love with him. Part of her was happy for him. He truly did want to do what was right, And maybe letting Maggie grow up in her home country with her doting grandma was the best choice. Krista just couldn't get over the fact she thought he had feelings for her. But she must have just been another woman in his life, tossed aside to make way for a blonde, probably a British socialite who loved to spend Daddy's money. She considered calling him on more than one occasion. Everyone in the apartment complex seemed to think she should get on a plane and run to him. But he left her, without a word, and weeks had dragged by with no communication, not even a like on her pictures on social media. She cut down on dairy and woke up early to do yoga on the beach again. Soon enough, she was back to her normal weight and in her favorite pair of denim shorts. So she got rejected by a billionaire. Go figure. She reasoned it did not make her a total loser. After all, how many women could say that they were kissed by a billionaire? The fact she had fallen for him was beside the point. They were never meant to be. She knew it. He knew it. She moved on. And yet, why could she never get his face out of her head? Why did she keep looking him up and thinking about sending him a text? While she took deep yoga breaths and thought about her mom, a sense of peace flooded her whole body. She tingled, and in her mind, she imagined her mom giving her the warmest hug. She knew that if she was still alive, she would give the best advice. But these quiet moments of peace would have to do.
I was told that I'd find you here.
Krista's eyes shot open and she blinked into the blinding sunshine, her heart racing. Had she fallen asleep? Then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A light baby squeal and a little voice saying, "Esta." Krista jumped to her feet as her eyes adjusted to the light and she looked at Maggie's beaming smile, her little hands stretching out to her. Benjamin stood, wearing a pair of board shorts and a blue t-shirt, and handed Maggie to her. Krista fought back tears as she nuzzled the baby. She cuddled her so tightly Maggie protested. "It's you," Krista said, looking up at Benjamin, who was smiling broadly.
"Yes, it's me," he said, humored.
"I owe you a massive apology."
He pulled out a bouquet of flowers from his bag and gave her a smolder. Krista knew she should let him grovel a bit before giving in, but her heart was so happy to see him again and have Maggie on her hip, she couldn't fight back the grin taking over her face. "I know what you're doing with Joey's," she blurted, bobbing Maggie up and down. "I think it's amazing." Benjamin's teeth blinded her, and he looked pleased with himself, like a little boy who had just been told he did a good job.
"I hear you're working there again,"
he said, taking a step closer. Krista's breath caught in her chest at the sense of his body so close to hers. "Uh-huh," she nodded. Benjamin stroked her hair away from her face, and rushes of joy flew to her chest. Her heart fluttered. What are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to act cool. Benjamin licked his lips and grinned at her like a tiger eyeing up its prey.
"Gina called. Turns out Maggie was not settling well. She was thinking that Maggie would be better off with me in England, after all."
He pressed his lips on Maggie's head, and she patted his cheek with a giggle. "Love you," Maggie said with a sigh. Krista's heart squeezed. Benjamin's eyes moved back to Krista's, and she bit her lip. "But you're here," she said faintly. Benjamin nodded.
"I was thinking, it'll be a lot easier to grow the franchise if I'm in the same country. And truth be told, I've grown quite fond of this place."
His eyes flickered to her lips, and Krista took a breath. "Oh, you have, huh?" She glanced at his puckered lips moving slowly towards her and found herself going giddy inside. "So, you thought you'd stay for a while?"
That depends. Do you want me to?
Me? Krista's face grew warm. Well, I'm sure. I mean, it makes sense because of Maggie, you know. Beads of sweat gathered at her temples as her heart began to race. Benjamin grazed her bottom lip with his thumb.
You know, I've heard there's a fun fair around here. I thought I'd take Maggie. Would you like to join us?
He inched even closer, and his breath tickled her lips. Maggie sucked on her thumb, looking from Benjamin to Krista with keen interest, wondering what they were doing. Are you asking me to be your nanny again? Krista asked, moving back slightly. Benjamin shook his head with a laugh.
Oh, no. What I want to do to you would make it wholly inappropriate to work for me.
He laughed again, and Krista wanted to do an excited dance on the spot, but resisted. Really? What did you have in mind? She asked. But Benjamin didn't need to say anything. They both knew the answer. Krista found herself making the move first. She closed the gap between them and kissed him for the briefest moment. Maggie giggled and clapped.
So, can I take you on a date? Benjamin asked, his brows raised.
Krista nodded, her heart almost bursting with joy as she snuggled Maggie close. She pecked Benjamin on the lips again and brushed his arm gently. I thought you'd never ask. Epilogue. You know, I always knew you two would end up together. Gina's cheeks were flushed as she beamed with pride at Krista. Maggie came running into the room, blonde curls bouncing. She wore a pink chiffon dress that billowed as she ran, carrying a basket of rose petals. Well, what have we got here? Gina bent down and tickled Maggie under the arms. Maggie squealed and dropped the basket, rose petals spilling out on the sandy floor. Krista smoothed out the white dress that hugged her body like a sleeve, and the material sparkled in the sunset. Thank you for doing this, Gina. Krista patted her on the arm, and Gina's rosy cheeks reddened even more. Her eyes moistened, and the two of them looked at each other with mutual respect. Once everyone agreed that they were on the same side, Benjamin had built a new house by the sea, with a whole wing just for Gina to live in. All animosity was gone. At the end of the day, everyone wanted Maggie to be happy. It was their love and devotion to the child that glued them together. Krista would have happily moved in within weeks, but Benjamin wanted to take things slow. Even though they had been living under the same roof from the beginning, they needed boundaries. He took her on many moonlight walks along the beach. They ate mountains of ice cream on the pier. They sang karaoke and continued to attend weekly salsa classes at the community center. When he took her to the edge of the beach one night and lowered himself to one knee, Krista didn't even let him say a word before she screeched, "Yes!" and flung her arms around him, smothering his face with kisses. Now, she was wearing her mother's lace wedding gown, and Gina was walking her down the sandy aisle to the love of her life. Every single resident from Krista's apartment complex came to the wedding, even grumpy old Mrs. Bailey, who still believed that her precious pooch died from sand poisoning, even though the vet said it was old age. Maggie threw petals on the floor as she marched up to the pastor. The guests laughed and snapped photos as she took Benjamin's hand. Then, Gina took Krista's arm. A string quartet began to play the wedding march, and the two of them walked together. Krista squeezed Gina's arm, holding back the tears that were threatening to fall. She looked at Benjamin, who stood tall and proud, with his hands clasped in front of him. He wore a soft cotton suit and the biggest grin in the world. His eyes twinkled at her as she joined him. Gina took Maggie as Krista turned to Benjamin. He leaned in to kiss her, but the pastor coughed. "Not yet," he said with disapproval. The guests chuckled again. The wedding ceremony was simple, elegant, and small. As they exchanged vows, the tide threatened to flood the whole wedding party. Once the pastor declared them man and wife, everyone clambered to their feet and cheered as Benjamin swooped Krista off her feet and they kissed as if their lives depended on it. Krista's heart was full, and she beamed at Benjamin all night as they danced under the moonlight. The staff had set up thousands of fairy lights behind the house, and the sound of laughter and happy chatter filled the air for hours. Christa imagined the sounds floating across the sea, spreading love and joy across the ocean. If love were tangible, she was certain it would take over the whole world. Finally, once they were left alone in their private part of the beach, Krista brushed her fingers through Benjamin's hair and pressed her lips on his forehead. "I love you, Benjamin," she whispered in his ear. He turned and pecked her on the cheek. "Do you want to know how much I love you?" he asked softly. Krista nodded. Her cheeks were aching from smiling so much. Then Benjamin picked her up, and she cried out with surprise as he carried her all the way back to the house. He kicked the door open, and Krista stifled a laugh as he marched in and made for their bedroom. "Mrs. Harris, this is just how much I love you," he boldly proclaimed as he threw her on the king-size bed and kicked the door shut.
This has been Tempted by a Billionaire by Laura Burton. Billionaires in the City, Book 5. Narrated by Connie Shabshab.